The night they dragged her through the marble halls like refuse, Elowen Draith learned the only lesson that matters in this world. Power doesn't respect ceremony. It respects teeth. And she had just discovered hers were sharper than anyone expected. This is the story of a woman who was supposed to disappear. Who didn't. Who became something the Empire never saw coming. Stay until the end. You'll want to see how this breaks. And drop your city in the comments. Let me know where my tribe is watching from. The chandeliers burned overhead like dying stars, casting gold across marble that had witnessed 1,000 rituals and not one truth. Elowen stood in the center of the throne room wearing white silk that felt like burial cloth against her skin. The fabric clung to her shoulders, her waist, marking her as chosen, as promised, as Luna to be for the Alpha King of Velmora. The scent of iron and old wood filled her nostrils. Beneath it, something sharper, fear disguised as incense. Her hands trembled at her sides, fingers curling into fists she forced open again. Presentation required stillness. Submission required grace. She had practiced both her entire life. King Valor Kryn stood before his throne, a monument carved from muscle and authority. His presence dominated the room not through size alone, but through the weight of every choice he'd made, every threat he'd delivered, every promise he'd kept. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, framing a face that could have been beautiful if it hadn't been forged into something harder. His eyes, pale amber, predator bright, swept across her body with the detachment of a man evaluating livestock. The court surrounded them in tiers of silk and jewels. Every noble family in Velmora gathered to witness the bonding ceremony that would cement the king's power for another generation. Elowen could feel their stares like hands on her skin, calculating, envious. Relieved it wasn't their daughter standing in white before a man who ruled through fear sharpened into law. Her mother had told her this was destiny. Her father had called it duty. Neither had mentioned it might feel like drowning on dry land. The High Chancellor stepped forward, robes rustling like dying leaves. His voice carried through the chamber with practiced authority. Valor, Alpha King of Velmora, third of his line, keeper of the northern reaches, do you accept this woman as your bonded mate, your Luna, your equal before the laws of blood and moon? The silence that followed stretched like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. Elowen's heartbeat thundered in her ears. This was the moment every girl in Velmora dreamed of, or feared in equal measure. The moment the bond would snap into place, tying her soul to the king's, making her something more than herself, something less than free. Valor's gaze locked onto hers. For one breath, she thought she saw something flicker behind those amber eyes. Recognition, maybe, or the ghost of regret. Then his expression hardened into absolute certainty. No. The word dropped into the chamber like a stone into still water. Ripples of shock moved through the crowd, manifesting as gasps and whispers that grew into a wave of disbelief. Elowen's breath caught. Her mind scrambled to process what she'd heard, to reshape it into something that made sense. This was ceremony. This was tradition. This was, I reject this bond, Valor said, his voice cutting through the rising chaos with brutal clarity. She is unworthy. The world tilted. Elowen felt something inside her chest crack. Not her heart, though that was breaking too, but something deeper. The potential bond, the future that had been woven into her DNA since birth, fracturing like glass under pressure. Your Majesty, the High Chancellor stammered, this is unprecedented. The arrangements have been— I am the arrangement, Valor interrupted. His eyes never left Elowen's face, watching her like a wolf watches prey that hasn't realized it's bleeding yet. The Draith line brings nothing Velmora needs. Weak bloodlines produce weak heirs. I will not dilute this throne with mediocrity dressed in white silk. The words landed like fists, each one a calculated blow designed to unmake her in front of everyone who mattered. Elowen's father surged forward from the crowd, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. Lord Elowen Draith was a man who'd built his power on alliances and careful positioning, and his daughter's bonding to the king was supposed to be his masterwork. This is an insult to our house, he snarled. The contracts were signed, the agreements sealed. Your house, Valor said softly, and somehow the quiet made it worse. is built on dust and desperation. The Draith name hasn't produced an alpha in 4 generations. Your daughter carries weakness in her blood. I will not tie myself to failure. Elowen stood frozen, her body refusing to respond to commands her brain kept screaming. Move! Speak! Defend yourself! But the shock had locked her joints, turned her into a statue witnessing her own destruction. Her mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. The woman who'd spent years preparing Elowen for this moment, drilling her in every ritual and expectation, now watching it all collapse into nightmare. The king's advisor, a thin man with eyes like chips of ice, stepped to Valor's side. The law requires cause for rejection, Your Majesty. Public humiliation of a chosen Luna without— I am the law, Valor said. His aura flared, a wave of pure dominance that sent several courtiers stumbling backward. Even from across the room, Elowen felt it crash over her like freezing water. Her knees wanted to buckle. Her wolf, the part of her that should have risen to meet his challenge, cowered somewhere deep inside her chest, whimpering. She was Omega, born to submit, bred to yield, and he was using that against her like a weapon. But if you require cause, he continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber, then witness this. I, Violor Kryn, reject Elowen Draith on the grounds of insufficient bloodline strength, demonstrated weakness of wolf spirit, and strategic liability to the crown. Let it be recorded. Let it be known. Each word was a nail driven into a coffin. The bond that had never formed still managed to shatter. Elowen felt it like phantom limbs being torn away. The future she'd been promised, the identity she'd built around this moment, the carefully constructed version of herself that was supposed to matter. All of it, gone. Her father's voice rose again, shaking with fury. You cannot simply— Guards, Valor said calmly, escort the Draith family from my sight. They are no longer welcome in the inner court. 2 soldiers materialized at Elowen's sides. Their hands closed around her arms. Not gentle, not rough, just efficient. Like she was furniture being removed to make space for something more valuable. The crowd parted as they dragged her backward. She caught glimpses of faces as they passed, some sympathetic, some triumphant, most carefully neutral. In Vilmora, backing the wrong family could destroy you. No one would risk defending her now. Her mother reached for her, tears streaming down her face. But Lord Draith grabbed his wife's arm and yanked her back. His expression had shifted from rage to something colder, calculation. He was already thinking ahead, already planning how to salvage what remained of their house, already cutting Elowen loose to save himself. The marble floor blurred beneath her feet as the guards hauled her through corridors that grew progressively dimmer, less ornate. They were taking her toward the outer districts, the parts of the palace complex where rejected mates and political embarrassments were processed and expelled. Her mind kept looping through the scene in the throne room, trying to find the moment where this could have been prevented. Had she stood wrong? Spoken out of turn during the approach? Failed some test she hadn't known she was taking? But deep down, beneath the shock and humiliation, a darker truth whispered. It didn't matter what she'd done. Valor had chosen this, had planned it. The rejection wasn't personal failure, it was political theater. She was the message, not the recipient. They shoved her into a stone chamber that smelled of mold and old fear. One guard unlocked her ceremonial jewelry with rough efficiency. The silver collar, the wrist cuffs, the crown of moonflowers that had taken her handmaiden 3 hours to weave into her hair. Each piece clattered to the floor like shed skin. The other guard pulled out a brand, a small iron rod with a symbol at its end. Elowen's eyes went wide. "Wait," she said, her voice cracking on the word. "Wait, please." "Rejected mates are marked," the first guard said, his tone bored. "It's protocol." The iron heated in a small brazier in the corner, glowing red, then orange, then white. The guard holding it approached her with mechanical purpose. Elowen tried to pull away, but the second guard locked her arms behind her back. She thrashed, her wolf finally stirring inside her, snarling with panic. But Omega strength was nothing against 2 trained soldiers. The brand pressed into the skin just below her collarbone. The pain was immediate and absolute, fire boring into flesh, the smell of burning skin filling her nostrils. She screamed, the sound tearing from her throat raw and animal. When the guard pulled the iron away, the mark remained, a broken circle, the universal symbol for rejection, for failure, for unworthiness. For the rest of her life, everyone who saw her bare skin would know what she was, what she wasn't. They threw clothes at her, rough wool, servant's garb, nothing like the silk she'd been wearing moments ago. Her fingers shook as she tried to dress, pain radiating from the brand with every movement. "You have until dawn to leave the inner city," the first guard said. "After that, the watch has orders to arrest you for trespassing." "What about my family?" The guard laughed, short, sharp, cruel. "Your family? Girl, you don't have a family anymore. Rejection severs all legal ties. You're nobody now." The words should have broken her, and part of her did break. The part that had believed ceremony mattered, that position was permanent, that she had value beyond what power decided to grant her. But something else stirred in the rubble, something that didn't beg, something that didn't break the way it was supposed to. They pushed her out through a side door into an alley that stank of refuse and rot. The night air hit her skin like a slap, cold and indifferent. Behind her, the palace rose toward the stars, all light and beauty and lies. Ahead, the outer district sprawled in darkness. Elowen stood in that alley for a long time, her hand pressed against the brand on her chest, feeling her pulse hammer beneath ruined skin. Her entire body shook, shock, pain, fear, rage, all mixing into something that had no name. She should have been crying. Most rejected mates spent their first night screaming themselves raw. But Elowen's eyes stayed dry, burning with something hotter than tears. Because standing there in that alley, branded and bleeding and stripped of everything she'd been promised, she understood something the king had forgotten to account for. You can't destroy someone who has nothing left to lose. You can only make them dangerous. The walk through the outer districts lasted hours, or maybe minutes. Time had stopped meaning anything beyond the rhythm of her feet hitting stone, the throb of pain in her chest, the careful navigation through streets that grew progressively worse. Buildings leaned against each other like drunks, their walls stained with decades of neglect. Broken windows stared down at her like empty eye sockets. The smell shifted from rot to smoke to something sweeter and worse, bodies that hadn't been collected, illness that hadn't been treated. This was Velmora, too, the part the inner court never saw, the part Elowen had been raised to ignore. People watched her pass from doorways and corners. Their eyes tracked the ruin of her court clothes, the blood staining the rough wool, the way she held herself, still straight back despite everything, some muscle memory of dignity she couldn't quite abandon. One woman, ancient and bent, called out as Elowen stumbled past. "You got the mark?" Elowen's hand went automatically to her chest, pressing against the brand through the fabric. The old woman nodded, her expression more tired than sympathetic. "Find the Hollow Bones Tavern 3 streets down. They don't turn away the marked. Not the first night, anyway." "Why?" Elowen's voice came out rough, barely recognizable as her own. The old woman's laugh was dry as dead leaves. "Because everyone there's been where you are, girl. Rejected, ruined, or running. The only difference is how long ago." Elowen found the tavern by following the sound of voices, rough and raw and alive in a way court conversation never was. The Hollow Bones was exactly what its name promised, a skeleton of a building held together by habit and desperation. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and spilled beer and the sharp tang of unwashed bodies. Every table held people who looked like they'd been chewed up by the Empire and spit out with pieces missing. The bartender, a massive woman with scars crossing her face like a roadmap of violence, looked up when Elowen entered. Her eyes went immediately to the bloodstain on Elowen's chest, the way her skin was too pale, the shock still written across her features. "You got coin?" Elowen shook her head. "Then you got nothing I want." The bartender turned away, dismissing her. Something hot and sharp rose in Elowen's chest. After everything, after being unmade in front of the entire court, after being branded like livestock, after walking through hell to get here, she was going to be turned away from a dive tavern because she couldn't pay. "I can work," she said. The bartender snorted. "Your court's soft. Probably never lifted anything heavier than a wine glass. I don't need workers. I need people who won't break the first time things get rough. Then test me." The woman turned back, one eyebrow raised. Her gaze swept over Elowen again, slower this time, reassessing. "You know what happens to pretty girls in places like this? I was rejected by the king tonight, Elowen said, her voice flat. Branded. Thrown out like garbage. Whatever you think can happen to me has already happened. The bartender studied her for a long moment. Then she grabbed a mop and bucket and thrust them at Elowen. Floor needs cleaning. Vomit in the corner, blood by the door, and don't ask whose. You work till dawn, you can sleep in the back room. But you steal, you cause trouble, you bring palace guards sniffing around, and I'll throw you to the street myself. Elowen took the mop. Her hands, which had spent years learning to hold teacups and dance cards and ceremonial flowers, closed around the rough wood handle. She worked. For hours she scrubbed floors that hadn't been clean in years. She hauled buckets of filthy water out to the alley. She wiped down tables scarred with knife marks and old burns. Every movement sent pain radiating from the brand, but she didn't stop, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant breaking. Around her, the tavern's customers drank and fought and laughed, with the desperation of people who'd stopped pretending tomorrow mattered. She heard fragments of their stories, debts that could never be repaid, families torn apart by the empire's laws, children sold to settle fabricated charges. She heard the word king spoken like a curse. Near dawn, when the last customers had stumbled out and the bartender was counting what passed for the night's earnings, a man slumped at the bar called out to Elowen. His voice was slurred, but his eyes were sharp. "You're the one, aren't you? The Luna who got rejected tonight." Elowen's hand stilled on the table she was wiping. Word travels fast. Everything travels fast when the king makes a spectacle. He laughed, bitter and raw. We all heard. Whole city knows by now. Valor Kryn rejected his chosen mate in front of the whole court, called her unworthy. She waited for the shame to hit, for the humiliation to crush her all over again. But all she felt was a strange, cold clarity. "He wasn't wrong," she said quietly. "I was unworthy." The man's eyebrows rose. "That's so." Elowen met his gaze. "I was weak. I was raised to submit, to smile, to accept whatever power decided I deserved." She set down the rag, her fingers curling into fists. "But that version of me died tonight." "Then what are you now?" The question hung in the smoke-filled air. Elowen looked around the tavern, at the broken people finding shelter in this broken place, at the bartender who'd given her a chance when she had nothing, at the man who asked questions instead of making assumptions, at the empire that had tried to erase her and didn't realize it had just set something loose. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I'm going to find out." The bartender called out from across the room. "Back room's through there. You got 4 hours before the morning crowd. Sleep if you can." Elowen found the room, calling it "that was generous." It was barely larger than a closet, with a straw mattress on the floor and walls so thin she could hear everything happening in the tavern beyond. She lay down on the mattress, her body finally acknowledging the beating it had taken. The brand throbbed with steady, relentless pain. Her muscles ached from hours of work they'd never been trained for. Her mind spun with images of the throne room, of Valor's face, of the moment everything she'd been promised turned to ash. But beneath the pain and exhaustion, something else grew. Not revenge. Not yet. Just a simple, absolute understanding. The Empire had shown her its true face tonight, and she would never, never forget what she'd seen. Sleep came in fragments. When it did, she dreamed of white silk burning, of chandeliers falling like stars, of a voice that was hers and not hers saying, "You should have made sure." The next weeks blurred into a rhythm of survival that had no grace, no beauty, only the brutal mathematics of staying alive. Elowen worked at the Hollow Bones from dusk until dawn, cleaning and serving and learning to navigate the violent ecosystem of people the Empire had discarded. The bartender's name was Mara, and she ran the tavern with the efficiency of a general commanding troops. She told Elowen the rules on the third night. Don't steal from customers. Don't serve the watch. Don't ask questions about what people do outside these walls. And don't ever, ever talk about what happens inside. Elowen learned to move through the room like a shadow, to anticipate fights before they started, to know which customers would pay and which would try to run. She learned which alleys to avoid after midnight and which street vendors would trade food for information. She learned that the outer districts weren't just poverty, they were a system, a machine designed to grind people down and extract every last drop of value before spitting them out. One night, a girl no older than 15 stumbled into the tavern with blood running down her face and terror in her eyes. Mara took one look and pulled her into the back room, barking at Elowen to watch the bar. When they emerged an hour later, the girl's wounds were cleaned and bandaged, and Mara was pressing coins into her hand along with whispered directions to somewhere safe. After the girl left, Elowen asked, "What happened to her?" Mara's expression could have cut glass. Debt collection. Her father owed money he didn't have, so they came for collateral. Tried to take her to one of the contract houses. Contract houses? Mara's laugh was poison. That's what they call them in the inner districts. Brothels, girl, they're brothels. But if you call them contract houses and make the girls sign papers they can't read, suddenly it's all legal. Empire loves its paperwork. Elowen felt something cold slide down her spine. How many? Mara shrugged. Dozens in this district alone, hundreds across the city. They target families with debt, particularly those with daughters. The law says debt can be transferred to dependents if the primary debtor can't pay. So they fabricate charges, inflate interest, make it impossible to clear the balance. Then they come collecting. And the king allows this? The king, Mara said carefully, benefits from this. The contract houses pay taxes. The debt collectors keep people desperate enough to accept any work at any price. Fear makes for compliant citizens. She fixed Elowen with a hard stare. You're starting to see it now, aren't you? What really holds this empire together? Elowen thought of the throne room, the marble and gold and burning chandeliers, the beautiful lie covering up streets like this. Control, she said quietly. Mara nodded. Control. And the belief that the people on top deserve to be there because they're stronger, smarter, better. That the people down here deserve what they get because they're weak. Do you believe that? Mara's scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile once. I used to. Then I learned that strength is just another word for cruelty wearing a crown. The words planted themselves in Elowen's chest like seeds in dark soil. She started paying attention differently after that, not just to surviving, but to understanding. She listened to the stories people told when they were drunk enough to forget caution. She watched the patterns of who came and went, who paid the watch to look the other way, which businesses thrived on misery. She learned the empire's machinery from the inside, and every gear she examined was slick with blood. It was during the 4th week that she felt it, the first tremor of change. She was hauling barrels from the tavern's cellar, work that should have broken her back but was becoming almost routine. Her muscles had hardened from the labor. Her hands, once soft and manicured, had developed calluses. Even her posture had shifted, less carefully composed, more ready to move, to fight, to run. But this was different. This came from deeper. She set down the barrel and pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat accelerate for no reason. Heat spread through her body like fire through dry grass. Her vision sharpened. She could suddenly see individual dust motes in the air, could hear conversations happening 3 rooms away with perfect clarity. Her wolf stirred. Not the cowering thing that had hidden during her rejection. Something else. Something that had been sleeping and was now opening its eyes. Elowen stumbled into the back room and locked the door. Her skin felt too tight, her bones aching with pressure from inside. She'd heard about this. Late manifestation, the awakening that sometimes came to Omegas in their 20s if it came at all. But this didn't feel like an Omega awakening. This felt like something the Empire had tried very hard to make everyone forget was possible. The change hit like lightning. Her body convulsed, muscles seizing and releasing in waves. She bit down on her sleeve to keep from screaming as her wolf pushed forward, demanding recognition, demanding space. When it finally settled, she found herself on her hands and knees, gasping for air. Her reflection caught in a piece of broken mirror on the wall. Her eyes had changed. Still brown, but threaded now with silver. And in their depths, something ancient looked back. Not pray. Never pray again. A knock on the door. Mara's voice. You alive in there? Elowen stood on shaking legs. Yes. You sure? Because whatever's happening, it sounds like dying. Elowen opened the door. Mara took one look at her face and went very still. Well, the bartender said finally. That's interesting. What? Your eyes, they're... She paused, searching for words. They're not Omega anymore. What are they? Mara's expression was unreadable. I've only seen that color once before. In a very old painting in the Royal Archives, Back when I worked in the palace before they threw me out. It was of the first ruling family. Before Valor's bloodline took the throne. They called them the Silver Court. Elowen's mind raced. The Silver Court was legend, myth, the kind of story parents told children about the empire's founding. Powerful wolves who'd ruled through something other than domination, who'd supposedly been wiped out 3 generations ago when Valor's grandfather had consolidated power. That's not possible, she said. Mara shrugged. You're the one with silver in your eyes, girl. You tell me what's possible. Over the following days, Elowen discovered what her awakening meant. Her strength had increased, not to alpha levels, but far beyond what any Omega should possess. Her senses had sharpened to the point where she could track individual scents through crowded streets. Her wolf, when she called it, answered with something that felt less like submission and more like partnership. She was changing, becoming something the Empire's carefully maintained hierarchy had no category for, and she wasn't the only one noticing. A man started watching the tavern from across the street, tall, lean, with the careful stillness of someone trained to hunt. Mara spotted him on the 5th night and cursed under her breath. You need to leave, she told Elowen. Tonight. Why? That's Kyle Torin. He's one of Valor's trackers. If he's here, it means someone reported unusual wolf activity, and if he's watching this place specifically, he knows about me. Mara nodded grimly. The king doesn't like surprises. And a rejected mate manifesting this late with that kind of power? That's a problem he'll want solved. Elowen looked at the tracker through the window. He wasn't hiding his presence. He wanted her to know she was being hunted. The message was clear. Run or die. But running meant accepting their rules, accepting that she was prey, that her existence was a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be acknowledged. And something in her, something new and silver and absolutely done with submission, refused. What if I don't run? Mara stared at her. Then he kills you. Or worse, he brings you back to Valor, and the king doesn't let threats live long enough to become problems. Maybe, Elowen said slowly, I'm not the one who should be worried about becoming a problem. She walked out the tavern's front door before Mara could stop her. The night air was cold and clear, carrying the smell of smoke and rot in the distant ocean. Across the street, Kyle Torin straightened when he saw her, his hand moving automatically to the blade at his hip. Elowen crossed the distance between them with deliberate steps. Not running, not hiding, meeting the threat head-on the way an alpha would, the way something older than alpha would. Torin's eyes widened fractionally when he got close enough to see her face, to catch the silver threading through her gaze. You're supposed to be dead, he said. His voice was rough, a weapon that had forgotten how to be gentle. Elowen smiled, and it felt like baring teeth. Lots of people seem to have made that mistake. The king doesn't make mistakes, just decisions other people have to live with, or die from. Usually. His hand hadn't left his blade. You know what I'm here for? To kill me? To bring me back in chains? She took another step closer, watching him resist the urge to step back. Tell me, Torin, which order did he give you? Something flickered across the tracker's face. Not quite doubt, but close enough. Both. With a preference for the first if you resist. And if I don't resist? He laughed, short and sharp. Then you're smarter than I thought. Come quietly, and maybe you get a trial before they execute you. Elowen felt her wolf rise inside her chest, pressing against her skin like a second heartbeat. The brand on her collarbone burned, not with pain anymore, but with something hotter, power recognizing itself, claiming space. Here's the thing about trials, she said softly. They only matter if you accept the court's authority to judge you. And I don't. Then you die here. He moved fast, tracker trained, alpha strong, blade singing as it cleared its sheath and dove toward her heart. Elowen moved faster. She didn't think about it, didn't plan the dodge that took her inside his guard, the strike that caught his wrist and sent the knife clattering across cobblestones. Her body knew things her mind hadn't learned, old knowledge written into blood that had been suppressed for generations. Torin's eyes went wide. He recovered, throwing a punch that should have shattered her jaw. She caught his fist in her palm, her fingers closing around his knuckles with strength that made him gasp. What are you? He demanded. Elowen looked at this man who'd come to kill her on a king's orders, who was trained and deadly, and absolutely certain he was the apex predator in this exchange. And she let him see what was growing inside her. the silver light in her eyes, the power that didn't submit or dominate, but existed as something else entirely, something the Empire had tried to erase because it couldn't be controlled. "I'm what happens," she said, "when you forget that power buried doesn't disappear. It waits." She released his hand and stepped back. "Go tell your king. Tell him the girl he rejected didn't die. Tell him she's becoming something he should have made sure stayed myth." Torrens stared at her, his expression caught between fear and something like awe. "Why not kill me?" "You could. I can see that now. Because I'm not him. I don't kill people for asking the wrong questions or being born the wrong way." She met his eyes. "But I will defend myself. And I will not run. So when you deliver your message, make sure Valor understands. The next time he sends someone for me, they better be prepared for war." The tracker nodded slowly. He retrieved his knife, his movements careful, keeping his eyes on her like she was a wild animal that might pounce. When he backed away into the shadows, Elowen stood in the empty street and felt the weight of what she'd just done settle into her bones. She'd declared herself, not as prey, not as supplicant, as a threat the king would have to acknowledge. There was no going back from this. Behind her, Mara had emerged from the tavern. Her scarred face was unreadable in the dim light. "You just made yourself the most dangerous woman in Velmora," the bartender said. Elowen turned to face her. "Good. Because I just realized something." "What's that?" "All those stories about the Silver Court, about rulers who governed through something other than fear. They weren't myths. They were history. History that Valor's bloodline erased because they couldn't compete with it." Her hands clenched into fists. They tried to breed it out of the population, to make sure no one remembered there was another way to have power. Mara studied her with ancient eyes. "And now you're going to remind them." "No," Elowen said. Her voice was quiet but absolute. "I'm going to become it. I'm going to gather everyone the Empire threw away. Every rejected mate, every fabricated debtor, every child they tried to sell. And I'm going to show them what happens when the foundation you built your throne on decides to stand up. That's rebellion." Elowen smiled, and this time it wasn't baring teeth. It was something colder, more patient. "That's justice. But in a system this corrupted, I suppose those look the same." The bartender was quiet for a long moment. Then she extended her hand. "I'm in." They shook, two women the Empire had tried to break, now rebuilding themselves into something it had no defense against. The next morning, word spread through the outer districts like wildfire. The rejected Luna had manifested. She'd faced down one of the king's trackers and sent him running. She had silver in her eyes and power in her blood. And she wasn't going anywhere. People started appearing at the Hollow Bones. Not customers, seekers. A woman whose sister had been taken by debt collectors. A man whose son had been conscripted and killed in a border war nobody could explain. Children with scars that told stories no child should know. All of them asking the same question. Is it true? Can you really stand against him? Elowen met each one, listened to each story. And with every tale of injustice, every casual cruelty dressed up as law, the thing growing inside her fed and strengthened. She wasn't just awakening to her wolf anymore. She was awakening to purpose. Mara helped her set up a back room for meetings. Word went out carefully through trusted channels. If you've been broken by the Empire, if you've been thrown away or cast out or marked as worthless, there's a place. There's someone listening. They came in trickles at first, then streams, then floods. Within a month, Elowen had something she'd never possessed in the palace. A network. People who owed her nothing but gave her everything. Information, loyalty, the truth about how the Empire actually functioned when you stripped away its ceremonies and lies. She learned which nobles were trafficking children, which judges were taking bribes, which laws were being selectively enforced to maintain control while appearing just. She learned that Valor's power wasn't actually as absolute as he pretended. It was maintained through careful alliances, strategic marriages, and a population too exhausted to fight back. But exhaustion wasn't permanent, and neither was power. 3 months after her rejection, Elowen stood in the back room of the Hollow Bones, surrounded by 24 people who'd become something more than followers. They were believers. In change. In the possibility that the world didn't have to be this way. A young man named Jarek spoke up, his voice rough from years working in the Forge districts. What's the plan? We keep gathering information, building our network, but eventually Valor's going to notice. He's going to send more than one tracker next time. Elowen nodded. I know, which is why we need to be ready when he does. She looked around at faces marked by survival, by resistance, by refusal to break. We're not strong enough yet to fight him directly, but we don't need to be. Then what's the goal? To expose him. To show Velmora what their king really is when you strip away the throne and the crown and all the pretty words about order and strength. She leaned forward, her silver-threaded eyes catching the lamplight. Veilor rules through fear. But fear only works if people believe the alternative is worse. What happens when they see another option? Another woman, older, with wisdom written in every line of her face. You're talking about replacing him. I'm talking about showing people they don't need someone like him at all. That power doesn't have to mean dominance. That strength can exist without cruelty. Elowen's voice was steady, absolute. I'm talking about being what the Silver Court was supposed to be. Not rulers who take, guides who serve. The room fell silent. Then Jarek laughed, not mocking, but amazed. You're insane, you know that? Elowen smiled, probably. But she gestured to all of them. So are all of you, because you're still here, still fighting, still believing things can change when every piece of evidence says they can't. So we might as well be insane together. They voted that night. Not to crown her, she refused that language. But to follow her, to build what she was building, to become the alternative Velmora didn't know it needed. Every hand rose. Afterward, when the others had filtered out into the night, and Mara was locking up the tavern, Elowen stood alone in the back room and felt the weight of what she'd just accepted. She'd become a leader, not through birth or ceremony, but through choice, hers and theirs. And somewhere in the palace, Veilor Kryn sat on his throne, completely unaware that the girl he'd rejected and branded and thrown away had just become the most dangerous force in his empire. But he would learn. They always did. The night Kael Torrin came back, Elowen was ready. She'd known he would return eventually. Trackers didn't give up, and kings didn't forget threats. The only question was whether he'd come alone or bring an army. He came with 5 others, all trained, all armed, all wearing the king's colors. They surrounded the Hollow Bones just after midnight, when the streets were empty and witnesses scarce. Professional, efficient, the way wolves cornered prey. But Elowen wasn't in the tavern. She was on the roof across the street, watching them kick in the door, watching them search the empty building, watching their confusion grow into frustration. Beside her, Jarek crouched low. This is a mistake. We should have run. Running is what prey does, Elowen said quietly. We're done being prey. Below, Torrin emerged from the tavern, his expression dark. He knew. Somehow he knew she was watching. He looked up. Their eyes met across the distance, and Elowen stood, letting the moonlight catch the silver in her gaze, letting him see that she wasn't hiding anymore, that she was done with shadows and fear. Torrin's hand moved to his blade, but before he could draw it, the street began to fill. People emerged from alleys and doorways, dozens of them, then hundreds. Every person Elowen had helped over the past months, every family she'd protected, every child she'd kept from being sold. They didn't carry weapons, they didn't threaten, they just stood there. A wall of bodies between the king's men and their target. Torrin looked around at the crowd, understanding dawning in his eyes. This wasn't a hunt anymore. This was a statement. Elowen called down to him, her voice carrying in the still air. Tell your king that rejection works both ways. I don't recognize his authority. I don't acknowledge his laws. And I will not yield to his violence. One of the other trackers moved forward, but Torrin held up a hand, stopping him. This is treason, the tracker said. Elowen's laugh was sharp. Treason requires accepting that the throne has legitimacy. I don't. None of us do. She gestured to the crowd surrounding them. We're building something different here, something your king can't understand because it's not built on fear. You can't win, Torrin said, but he sounded less certain now. We already are. Every person here is someone your empire threw away. Someone it told was worthless, weak, expendable. And yet here they stand. She leaned forward, her voice dropping, but somehow still clear. Tell Veilor that the foundation of his throne is crumbling. And when it falls, I'll be there to watch. The trackers left without bloodshed. They had no choice. Attacking that many civilians would have sparked riots. and riots were messy, unpredictable, dangerous even for an alpha king. As they disappeared into the night, the crowd began to disperse, but not before each person met Elowen's eyes, acknowledging her, trusting her, choosing her. Mara climbed up to the roof, breathing hard. That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen. Elowen turned to face her friend. Not stupid. Strategic. Valor needs to understand that killing me won't solve his problem, because I'm not the problem. She looked out over the outer districts, at the thousands of people living in the shadow of the palace's light. They are. All of them. Every single person he's crushed and discarded. I'm just the one who reminded them they don't have to stay down. What happens now? Now, Elowen said, we prepare. Because Valor's going to come for me himself eventually, and when he does, she stopped. Because standing in the street below, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure she recognized even from this distance. Tall, dark-haired, moving with the absolute certainty of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. King Valor Kryn stood in the outer districts, in the filth and poverty he pretended didn't exist, staring up at the woman he'd rejected, and she stared back. Neither moved, neither looked away. The moment stretched like a blade pressed against skin, pressure building, waiting for the break. Then Valor smiled. Not cruel, not mocking, curious. He turned and walked away, his form dissolving into darkness. But Elowen felt the shift in the air, the change in the game they were playing. He knew now, really knew, that she wasn't just surviving, she was becoming. And the Empire, his Empire, had just run out of time to stop her. Beside her, Mara whispered, "What do we do?" Elowen's hands clenched on the roof's edge, her heart hammering with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite rage. It was recognition. The king had just declared war, and she was going to finish it. The thing about kings is they don't visit the outer districts unless they're planning to burn them down or claim something they've decided belongs to them. Valor Kryn standing in that street wasn't reconnaissance. It was a declaration. Elowen didn't sleep that night. Neither did anyone else in the network. Word spread faster than fire. The king himself had come, had seen, had walked away without violence. Some took it as victory. Others recognized it for what it was, the moment before the storm breaks. Mara found Elowen on the roof at dawn, still watching the street where Valor had stood. The bartender carried 2 cups of something that smelled like coffee and regret. "You look like hell," Mara said. Elowen took the cup without looking away from the street. "I feel like I just showed my hand to someone who's been playing this game since birth." "You did." Mara sat beside her, her scarred face catching the early light. Question is whether that was stupid or brilliant. Both, probably. Elowen finally turned to face her friend. He smiled, Mara, right before he left, like he'd just figured something out. "What?" "That I'm not a problem to solve, I'm a challenge to win. And kings like challenges, they're the only things that make them feel alive." She took a sip of the bitter liquid, letting it burn down her throat. I reminded him what it's like to want something he can't just take. Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You know what happens to things kings want, right? They get destroyed or possessed, nothing in between. So, what's the plan?" Elowen looked out over the outer districts as they woke. People emerging for another day of survival. Another rotation through the machinery of an empire that ground them down and called it order. We stop reacting. We stop waiting for him to make the next move. We become what he can't predict. How? By doing what the Silver Court did. Not ruling through force, not even through resistance. She set down her cup, her silver-threaded eyes reflecting the rising sun. Through alternative. We build something so fundamentally different from what he offers that people start choosing it. Not because we force them, because it works better. Mara laughed, sharp and disbelieving. "You want to outgovern a king while living in a tavern basement? I want to show people they don't need a king at all. That the entire structure, the hierarchy, the dominance games, the idea that someone has to rule and everyone else has to submit, is a choice. And we can choose differently." Elowen stood, her body aching from a night without rest, but her mind clear. The outer districts have been governing themselves for years. We just call it survival instead of governance. I'm going to make that visible. Make it real. Make it something people can believe in. And when Valor comes to crush it, then we show him that you can't crush an idea whose time has come. Her voice was steel-wrapped in certainty. You can only become irrelevant while it grows. The next weeks were a masterclass in building revolution from rubble. Elowen didn't call it that. Revolution implied violence, chaos, the kind of dramatic overthrow that gave kings an excuse to deploy their armies. Instead, she called it reconstruction. They started with the debt system. Mara knew a forger who could reproduce the empire's official seals. Jarek had a cousin who worked in the records office. Between them, they began systematically erasing fabricated debts, destroying the paperwork that kept families trapped in contracts that benefited no one but the collectors. Within 2 weeks, a dozen families were freed from obligations they'd never legitimately owed. Within a month, the collectors started noticing. One came to the Hollow Bones personally, a thick-necked man named Corvus, who ran the Southern District's extraction operation with the efficiency of a butcher and the morals to match. He kicked open the door at midday when the tavern was half full of people who'd become something more than customers. Witnesses. "Which one of you is burning my contracts?" he demanded. Elowen stood up from where she'd been sitting with a family whose daughter had just been freed from a brothel contract. She moved toward Corvus with measured steps, her presence filling the space in a way that made several people stand up automatically, forming a loose circle. "Define yours," she said calmly. Corvus's face reddened. "You think you're clever? You think you can just destroy legal documents and face no consequences? I think your legal documents are fabrications designed to trap people in permanent servitude while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy." Elowen stopped just outside his reach. "I think you prey on families who can't read the fine print or afford lawyers to challenge terms that compound interest at rates no honest business would charge. And I think you're angry because your profit model requires people to believe they have no choice." Corvus took a step forward, his hand moving to the club at his belt. His aura flared, beta strong, intimidating to most civilians, designed to make people fold. Elowen didn't fold. Her own aura rose to meet his, and the air between them crackled with competing energies. Silver threaded through the space, marking her as something his hierarchy didn't have words for. The collector's eyes widened. "What the hell are you?" "Someone who's done being afraid of men like you." She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. The threat was in the absolute certainty of her stance. "Leave. Tell your bosses the outer districts aren't hunting grounds anymore. Tell them the protection money stops, the fabricated debts end, and if they want to do business here, they do it honestly or not at all. You're declaring war on the entire collection system. You know what that means? It means I'm giving people a choice you've spent years making sure they didn't have." She leaned forward slightly. "Now get out before I show you what else has changed around here." Corvus left, but not before making it clear this wasn't over. 3 days later, a girl disappeared from the Eastern District. 12 years old, daughter of a family Elowen's network had just freed from debt. Taken in broad daylight. Message clear as blood. Mara brought the news while Elowen was meeting with community leaders in the back room. The bartender's face was pale with rage. They took Sarah Mattis, the debt collector's people. Witnesses saw them drag her into a carriage with the collection house seal. The room went silent. Everyone understood what this meant. The Empire was pushing back, testing to see if Elowen's protection was real or just theater. "How long ago?" Elowen asked, her voice flat. 2 hours. They'll have her at the Central Processing House by now. The one near the Palace District border. She paused. "It's guarded." "Well guarded. You can't just walk in there." Elowen stood. "Why not?" "Because it's suicide. Because they're expecting you to try. Because this is a trap designed to either kill you or make you look weak when you back down." Mara's scarred face was desperate. "We can negotiate. Offer them something. We offer them nothing." Elowen's eyes had gone completely silver, her wolf pressing against her skin like a second heartbeat. They took a child to make a point. "I'm going to take her back and make a different one." Jarek stood as well. "Then we're coming with you." "No." Elowen's voice was absolute. "If this goes wrong, the network needs to survive. You stay here. You keep building what we started. And if I don't come back..." "You'll come back," a voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. Kael Torin stood there, his tracker's uniform dusty from travel, his expression unreadable. What the hell are you doing here? Mara demanded, her hand moving to the blade she kept behind the bar. Torin's eyes stayed on Elowen. I came to warn you. Valor knows about the collection house situation. He authorized them to take the girl. He's using her as bait. Then it's working. Elowen moved toward him. Why warn me? Because I've been watching what you're building out here, and I've been watching what the king is becoming. The tracker's jaw tightened. I took an oath to protect Velmora, not to protect one man's ego. That's treason. That's choosing which version of treason I can live with. He pulled a map from his jacket, spreading it on the table. The collection house has 12 guards, 6 at the entrances, 6 rotating interior. Standard shift change happens at sunset. That's your window. Why are you helping me? Torin met her silver-threaded gaze. Because 3 months ago, you could have killed me. Should have, tactically. But you let me walk away. You chose mercy when you had every reason to choose violence. He gestured to the map. Maybe I'm curious to see what kind of world gets built by someone who makes choices like that. The collection house loomed against the twilight sky like a rotting tooth, its stone walls stained with decades of misery dressed up as bureaucratic necessity. Elowen approached from the east, using the shift-change chaos exactly as Torin had predicted. She wore plain clothes, her hair covered, her brand hidden beneath a high collar. Just another servant girl running an errand, invisible in the way the Empire had taught her to be before it tried to make her disappear entirely. The difference was now she chose to be invisible, and she could choose to stop. She slipped past the distracted guards during the shift handover, moving through corridors that smelled of mold and fear and the particular stench of institutions that processed human beings like paperwork. Voices echoed from rooms she passed, children crying, adults pleading, collectors laughing at desperation they'd learned to monetize. Every sound fed the thing growing inside her chest, the rage that wasn't hot anymore, that had cooled into something patient and surgical and absolutely done with systems that required suffering to function. She found Sarah in a basement cell, huddled in a corner with 3 other children who'd been collected that week. The girl's eyes went wide when she saw Elowen. "You came," she whispered. "I came." Elowen knelt by the cell door, pulling out the lockpicks Mara had taught her to use. Always come for your people. That's the only rule that matters. The lock clicked open. She ushered the children out, keeping them quiet with hand signals and the kind of authority that didn't need words. They moved through the corridors like ghosts, Elowen's enhanced senses tracking guard positions by sound and scent. They almost made it. The alarm went up 3 corridors from the exit. Someone had found the empty cell. Shouts echoed through the building, boots hammering on stone as guards mobilized. Elowen pushed the children toward a storage room. "Hide here. Don't come out until I come back for you." "What if you don't come back?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "Then someone else will. Because we don't leave people behind anymore." She pressed a scrap of paper into the girl's hand with the Hollow Bones address. "If I'm not back in an hour, run to this place. Ask for Mara. Tell her what happened." She stepped into the corridor as the first guards rounded the corner, 5 of them, armed, angry at being made to look foolish. The leader, a scarred man with collector insignia on his shoulder, smiled when he saw her. "The silver-eyed bitch. The king's going to be pleased we caught you. You haven't caught me." Elowen's voice was calm. "You've just given me an opportunity to demonstrate something." "Demonstrate what?" "That you're not as dangerous as you think you are." They rushed her as a unit, trained coordination meant to overwhelm through numbers. But Elowen had spent 3 months learning to fight from people who'd survived the outer districts, not through formal training, but through desperate necessity. Street fighting, dirty tactics, using your opponent's expectations against them. The first guard expected her to dodge backward. She went forward instead, inside his guard, striking his throat with the edge of her hand. He went down choking. The second expected Omega weakness, got Silver Court strength instead. Her kick caught his knee at an angle that sent him crashing into the third guard. The fourth and fifth hesitated, fear creeping into their expressions as they reassessed what they were facing. Elowen didn't give them time to adapt. She moved like water through gaps in their defense, striking with precision her instructors in the palace would never have taught, because it wasn't elegant. It was effective. When the last guard hit the floor, she stood over them breathing hard, her knuckles bleeding, her body singing with adrenaline and the dark joy of discovering she was stronger than anyone had told her she could be. She retrieved the children, led them out through the main entrance this time. No more hiding, no more sneaking, walking out like she owned the building, because in that moment she did. The news of the collection house rescue spread through Velmora like lightning through dry timber. The outer districts erupted in celebration. Small victories had been won before, but this was different. This was direct confrontation with an institution everyone had learned to fear, and that institution had lost. But in the palace, the reaction was colder and infinitely more dangerous. Violor Kryn received the report in his private study, a room designed to remind anyone who entered that power wasn't just political, it was architectural. High ceilings, dark wood, windows that looked out over the entire city like a predator surveying its hunting ground. His advisor, Matthias Kane, delivered the news with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned that kings didn't appreciate messengers who showed too much emotion about failure. She walked in and walked out with 4 children. Made fools of your collection system in the process. Matthias paused. The outer districts are calling her a hero. Velor didn't react visibly, didn't throw things or shout or make threats. He simply stood there, his back to Matthias, looking out over the city he'd inherited and shaped and controlled through fear calibrated so precisely. Most people called it justice. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, thoughtful, which made it more dangerous. Tell me about her network. Matthias pulled out a report, though they both knew the king had already memorized every detail. Estimated 200 active members, mostly lower-class citizens. Some mid-tier merchants who've grown tired of the protection schemes. A few former palace workers. He hesitated. And Kael Torin. Velor turned slowly. My tracker is working with her? He hasn't reported in weeks. Intelligence suggests he's been feeding her information. Matthias's voice was carefully neutral. Treason, obviously. Obviously. Velor's smile was a knife edge, but predictable. Torin always had too much conscience for the job. The question is whether Elowen knows how to use him, or if she's collecting strays out of sentiment. She's not sentimental, a new voice said from the doorway. Both men turned. A woman stood there, tall, dark-haired, wearing the kind of beauty that looked like it had been weaponized deliberately. Celine Vex, the king's spy master and the only person in the empire who could enter Velor's private study without announcement. She's strategic, Celine continued, moving into the room with predatory grace. Everything she does serves multiple purposes. The collection house rescue freed the children, yes, but it also demonstrated her network's capability, exposed weaknesses in your enforcement infrastructure, and gave the outer districts a victory they can rally around. She met Velor's eyes without flinching. She's not playing emotion. She's playing chess. Then we adapt our strategy. Velor gestured for Matthias to leave. The advisor did, gratefully. When they were alone, Celine poured 2 glasses of wine from the decanter on Velor's desk. She handed him one, her fingers brushing his deliberately. You're thinking about her too much, she observed. I'm thinking about a threat to my throne. You're thinking about a woman who stood in your throne room and didn't break when you tried to unmake her. There's a difference. Celine sipped her wine, her expression calculating. You rejected her because she was weak. Now she's becoming strong, and that intrigues you more than it should. Velor's jaw tightened. Careful, Celine. Why? We both know your marriage to me is political. Has been from the start. She set down her glass. I give you legitimacy with the Northern Territories. You give me power and position. It's transactional. But Elowen, she paused, watching his reaction. She represents something else entirely. Something you can't control or predict or dismiss. She represents chaos that needs to be eliminated. Then why haven't you? You could have sent 50 men to that collection house instead of 5. Could have killed her a dozen times by now. But you don't. You watch. You wait. You test. Celine leaned against his desk. You're treating her like a courtship. That's absurd. Is it? Think about what you're doing. You rejected her publicly, destroyed her socially, threw her into the outer districts to die. Classic dominance display. But when she didn't die, when she came back stronger, you didn't crush her. You engaged. You showed up in her territory. Let her see you see her. That's not how you treat enemies, Velor. That's how you treat potential mates. The wine glass shattered in Velor's hand. He didn't seem to notice the blood running down his palm, his aura spiking with fury so intense the windows rattled. She's a threat, he said through clenched teeth. Nothing more. Celine stood, unfazed by his anger. Then kill her. Stop playing games, stop testing her, stop giving her opportunities to grow stronger. Send your entire guard force. Burn the outer districts to ash if you have to. Eliminate the problem. She moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. Unless you can't. Unless some part of you wants to see how far she'll go, how strong she'll become, how close she'll get to actually challenging you. She left before he could respond. Valor stood alone in his study, bleeding onto imported carpet, looking out at the city that had always bent to his will. But his eyes tracked south, toward the outer districts where someone was building an alternative to everything he'd constructed, where a woman he'd destroyed was rising from the ashes wearing silver in her eyes and certainty in her spine. And for the first time in his reign, Vialor Kryn felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the presence of an equal. It terrified him. It excited him. It made him want to either destroy her or claim her, and he was no longer certain which impulse would win. The problem with building revolution is that eventually the enemy stops reacting and starts planning. Elowen understood this in her bones. The collection house victory had been important, necessary, proof that the Empire's institutions weren't untouchable. But it had also forced Valor to take her seriously. And serious attention from a king was rarely survivable. She called a meeting of her inner circle 2 days after the rescue. 20 people gathered in the Hollow Bones' expanded back room. The network had grown enough that Mara had knocked out walls to make space. Jarek spoke first, his voice tight with concern. Patrols have increased in every district. They're not being subtle about it. They're looking for you. Let them look. Elowen stood at the head of the table, the position feeling less awkward now than it had months ago. We knew this was coming. The question is how we respond. An older man named Cass, who'd been organizing the dock workers, leaned forward. We could go quiet for a while. Let things cool down. We've made our point. And lose momentum? A woman named Thera shook her head. People are joining us because we're winning, because they believe change is possible. We go quiet. That belief dies. They're both right, Mara said. Which means we're at the decision point every rebellion hits. Escalate or consolidate. Elowen looked around at faces that had become familiar over months of shared purpose. These weren't followers anymore. They were partners, equals building something together. What if we do both, she said slowly. We consolidate what we've built here, make it permanent, visible, undeniable, and we escalate by making it so legitimate the Empire can't dismiss it as criminal activity. Torin, who'd been leaning against the back wall, straightened. You want to formalize the network? I want to create alternative governance. Real governance. Elowen's voice gained strength as the idea crystallized. We already settle disputes, distribute resources, protect our people. We're doing everything a government does. We just call it survival. What if we stopped hiding that? What if we declared the outer districts autonomous? The room exploded into argument. Half the people thought it was brilliant. Half thought it was suicide. Mara banged her fist on the table until silence fell. You're talking about secession, she said flatly. That's not rebellion. That's war. Only if Valor makes it war. Elowen met her friend's eyes. We're not taking territory from him. The outer districts have never really been his. They're just close enough to the palace that he pretends to rule them while doing nothing to actually govern them. We're making visible what's already true. He'll send his army anyway, Jarek said. You know he will. Maybe. Elowen's jaw set. But armies require soldiers willing to fight, and soldiers come from families. Families we've been helping, people we've been protecting. She looked around the table. How many of the palace guard have relatives in the outer districts we've freed from debt? How many have daughters we kept out of contract houses? Torin's eyes widened. You're not trying to fight the army. You're trying to fracture its loyalty. I'm trying to make this choose between orders and conscience. Elowen's voice was steady. The Empire runs on the belief that power flows from the top down, that the king commands and everyone below obeys. But power actually flows from consent, from people choosing to participate in the system. We're offering them a different choice. Thera stood slowly. If we do this, if we actually declare autonomy, we need to be ready for the response. We need food stores, medical supplies, defensive positions. We need allies, Cass added. Other districts. Other cities. We can't stand alone. Then we don't stand alone. Elowen felt her heart racing with possibility and terror in equal measure. We send delegations to every territory that's ever been squeezed by Vaelor's tax policies or brutalized by his enforcement. We offer them the same thing we're building here, self-determination without domination. You're talking about dismantling the empire, Mara said softly. I'm talking about showing people the empire already doesn't work for them. That it's held together by habit and fear, not by actual benefit to most of its citizens. Elowen's silver eyes blazed. We're not destroying anything that wasn't already broken. We're just building something new in the cracks. The vote was split, but the majority carried. They would declare the outer districts autonomous, would formalize what they'd been building into actual governance structure, would invite other territories to join them in creating an alternative to Vaelor's rule, would bet everything on the possibility that people, given a real choice, would choose freedom over fear. After the meeting dissolved into planning committees and logistics discussions, Torin pulled Elowen aside. His expression was troubled. You know what you're asking of them, right? Most of these people have families, lives. If this fails, Vaelor won't just kill you. He'll erase everyone associated with you. I know. The weight of it sat on Elowen's shoulders like physical pressure. But if we don't do this, if we keep operating in the shadows, picking off individual injustices while the system remains intact, nothing fundamentally changes. The empire will keep grinding people down forever. That's a lot of weight for one person to carry. Good thing I'm not carrying it alone, she met his eyes. Why are you really here, Torin? You were the king's tracker, his weapon. What made you switch sides? Torin was quiet for a long moment. Then, I watched you let me live when you could have killed me. And I kept thinking, if you'd been on the throne instead of Vaelor, would you have sent someone to hunt down a rejected mate in the first place? Would you have built a system that requires that kind of cruelty? And you decided the answer was no. I decided I'd spent 10 years enforcing a version of order that required constant violence to maintain. And maybe that's not order at all. Maybe that's just organized brutality with good PR. He shifted uncomfortably. You're offering something different. I want to see if it's possible, even if it costs you everything, especially if it costs me everything. Torin's scarred hands clenched. Because if it works, it means all the things I did for Vaelor weren't necessary. That there was always another way and I was just too conditioned to see it. And if it fails, he shrugged. At least I'll know I tried. Elowen clasped his shoulder. Then let's make sure it works. The declaration of autonomy happened on the first day of the harvest moon, during the festival that had always marked the empire's strength and abundance. The timing wasn't accidental. If they were going to challenge Vaelor, they'd do it when the entire city was watching. Elowen stood on a platform in the central square of the outer districts, the same square where children had been sold, where debt collectors had operated openly, where the empire's machinery had ground people down in plain sight. Now it was packed with thousands of people, her people, citizens of what they were about to become. She wore simple clothes, no ceremonial regalia, no symbols of rank, just practical fabric and boots scuffed from months of walking these streets. Her hair was pulled back, revealing the brand on her collarbone that had once marked her as rejected, that now marked her as transformed. Mara stood to her left, Jarek to her right. Torin remained in the crowd, watching for threats. The entire inner circle surrounded the platform, a visible demonstration that this wasn't one woman's ambition. This was a movement. Elowen raised her hands, and the crowd quieted. Her voice carried without shouting. Months of practice speaking to gathered citizens had taught her how to project without seeming to try. 3 months ago, I stood in a throne room and was told I was unworthy, that my bloodline was weak, that I had nothing to offer this empire. She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the crowd. The king was right about one thing. I had nothing to offer his empire, because his empire requires submission. It requires people to accept that their worth is determined by those in power, that survival means yielding to systems designed to extract everything from you while giving nothing back. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, but I learned something in these streets over the past months. I learned that the people the empire calls worthless are the ones who keep it functioning. You build the buildings, you grow the food, you maintain the infrastructure. You are the foundation everything else stands on. Her voice grew stronger. And foundations don't beg permission from the structures they support. They choose whether to keep standing. The murmur grew louder. So today, we make a choice. We, the people of the outer districts, declare ourselves autonomous. We will govern ourselves. We will settle our own disputes, distribute our own resources, protect our own people. We will build systems that serve citizens instead of extracting from them. And we invite every territory, every district, every community that has suffered under the Empire's policies to join us in creating something new. Silence fell, absolute and breathless. This is not rebellion, Elowen continued. This is recognition of what's already true. The Empire never governed us. It only exploited us. We're simply making that visible. She pulled out a document, the declaration they'd spent weeks drafting, arguing over, perfecting. And we're inviting King Valor Kryn to acknowledge what power actually means. Not the ability to dominate, but the consent of those being governed. When that consent is withdrawn, authority becomes nothing but violence pretending to be law. She signed the document with deliberate strokes. Then Mara, then Jarek, then every member of the inner circle. Then she held it up for the crowd to see. Who stands with us? The roar that answered was seismic, thousands of voices rising in affirmation, not worship, not submission, recognition that something fundamental had just shifted. The outer districts weren't begging for change. They were creating it. From the palace walls, Valor Kryn watched through a spyglass as the crowd erupted in celebration. His face was stone, but his hand gripping the railing turned white-knuckled. Beside him, Matthias shifted nervously. Your orders, Majesty? Valor lowered the spyglass slowly. His amber eyes were cold enough to frost steel. Summon the council, mobilize the guard, and send word to every noble house in Velmora. He turned to face his advisor, and Matthias took an involuntary step backward at what he saw in the king's expression. She wants to challenge my authority? Fine. I'll show her what authority backed by force actually means. You're going to attack the outer districts? I'm going to remind my kingdom what happens to treason dressed up as governance. His smile was a predator's anticipation of the kill. Elowen Draith thinks she can dismantle an empire with speeches and paperwork. I'll teach her that empires aren't built on consent. They're built on the willingness to do what others won't. The war, such as it was, began not with armies, but with isolation. Valor's first move was to cut off the outer districts completely. No trade, no traffic, no communication with the rest of the city. Guards stationed at every border checkpoint with orders to turn away anyone trying to enter or leave. Economic siege. Classic tactics. But he'd miscalculated. The outer districts had been economically abandoned for years. They'd learned to be self-sufficient because the Empire never provided for them anyway. And now with Elowen's network coordinating resources and Cass's dock workers secretly smuggling in supplies, the siege was more symbolic than effective, which meant Valor had to escalate. The message arrived 3 days after the declaration. A formal invitation to the palace, addressed to Elowen personally, requesting her presence at a summit to discuss the district's concerns. Mara read it and immediately tore it in half. It's a trap. Obviously, Elowen picked up the pieces, studying the wax seal, genuine royal insignia. But it's an interesting trap. There's no such thing as an interesting trap, Jarek said. There's just dead and alive. He's offering negotiation, Torin observed. That means he's not ready for full military assault yet, probably waiting to see if he can fracture your support by making you look unreasonable for refusing to talk. Then we talk. Elowen's decision was immediate and absolute. The room erupted in protest. Mara's voice rose above the others. He rejected you publicly, branded you, tried to have you killed, and now you're going to walk into his throne room like nothing happened? No. Elowen met her friend's furious gaze. I'm going to walk into his throne room like everything happened, like I survived it, like I'm not afraid of him anymore. She stood, her silver eyes blazing. Valor wants me to refuse so he can claim I'm unreasonable, or he wants me to accept so he can kill me and decapitate the movement. Either way, he thinks he controls the outcome. But I'm going to give him a third option he hasn't considered. I'm going to negotiate as an equal, not as a subject requesting mercy, as a leader of autonomous territory discussing terms with a neighboring power. She smiled, sharp and dangerous. I'm going to make him recognize in front of his entire court that I'm not his to command anymore." "That's insane," Thera breathed. "But it might work. It has to work. Because if I don't go, he sends his army. If I go and submit, we lose everything we've built. But if I go and hold my ground," she looked around at her inner circle, "we force him to choose between acknowledging our legitimacy or revealing that his power is built entirely on violence. Either way, we win. Or you die," Mara said bluntly. "Then you keep building without me." Elowen's voice was steel. That's how movements work. They don't depend on one person. They depend on an idea whose time has come. The council voted. Narrowly, she was authorized to attend. But Torin pulled her aside afterward, his expression troubled. "You understand what you're walking into? Valor doesn't forgive. He doesn't compromise. And he's obsessed with you in a way that's dangerous." Define obsessed. The way a predator is obsessed with prey that got away. The way a king is obsessed with a challenge to his throne. The tracker's jaw tightened. The way a man is obsessed with a woman he can't have and can't forget. "Good." Elowen's smile was cold. "Let him be obsessed. Obsession makes people stupid, and I need him stupid for what comes next." The throne room hadn't changed. Same marble, same chandeliers, same golden light that made everything look like a painting instead of a place where real decisions with real consequences got made. But Elowen had changed. She walked through those massive doors not as a girl in ceremonial white, but as a woman wearing practical travel clothes, her silver-threaded eyes meeting every courtier's stare without flinching. The brand on her collarbone was visible. She'd worn her collar deliberately low to make sure everyone saw it. Shame transformed into armor. The court whispered as she passed. Recognition, scandal, disbelief that the rejected mate had returned, and returned looking more dangerous than the king who'd tried to destroy her. Valor sat on his throne, dark and massive and radiating the kind of controlled power that made lesser wolves want to roll over and expose their throats. But when his eyes locked onto Elowen's, something flickered in their amber depths. Recognition, maybe. Or fear dressed up as fury. "Elowen Draith," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber. "You dare enter my presence after declaring treason against the crown?" She stopped in the center of the floor, exactly where she'd stood during her rejection. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone watching. "King Valor," she replied, her tone absolutely neutral. "I came in response to your invitation to discuss governance of autonomous territories. I'm here to negotiate as a representative of the outer districts. You're here as a traitor who will answer for her crimes. I'm here as someone you don't have authority over anymore." She let that land, watched the court's reaction, shock, fascination, horror at her audacity. "You rejected me, Your Majesty, severed all legal ties, declared me unworthy of being connected to your throne. So by your own decree, I'm not your subject. I'm simply a neighbor requesting diplomatic conversation." Valor's aura flared. The air pressure in the room changed, making several courtiers stumble. But Elowen stood perfectly still, her own power rising to meet his challenge. Silver met gold in the space between them, and for the first time in the history of that throne room, a king's dominance met something that didn't submit, that simply refused to acknowledge his right to dominate. Valor rose slowly from his throne. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "You think changing your eyes changes what you are. You're still Omega, still weak bloodline, still everything I named you. And yet I'm standing here." Elowen took a step forward, her voice calm but carrying to every corner of the chamber. "I survived your rejection. I survived your attempts to erase me. I built something from nothing in the territories you abandoned, so either your assessment of my weakness was wrong, or your understanding of what strength means is incomplete." The silence that followed could have shattered glass. Then Valor laughed. Not mocking, something darker, more genuine. "You've become interesting," he admitted. "I'll give you that. I've become ungovernable. There's a difference." Elowen held his gaze. "So here's my offer. Recognize the outer districts as autonomous. Stop the siege. Let us govern ourselves. In exchange, we won't interfere with the rest of your empire. We'll trade fairly, maintain peaceful borders, and prove that alternative systems can coexist. And if I refuse, then you send your army. You crush us. You reassert your power through violence." She paused. And you prove to everyone watching that your authority has no foundation beyond the ability to hurt people who disagree with you. That might keep you on your throne, but it makes you a tyrant, not a king. I've always been both. Maybe. But you used to pretend otherwise. She gestured to the court surrounding them. All of this, the ceremony, the laws, the hierarchy, it's designed to make your power look legitimate, natural, deserved. The moment you have to rely purely on force, you admit that's all it ever was. Vialor descended from his throne, moving toward her with predatory grace. The court held its collective breath. He stopped close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the flecks of darker gold in his eyes. His voice dropped to something only she could hear. "You're playing a dangerous game, Elowen." "So are you," she replied just as quietly. "You could have killed me quietly months ago. You didn't. You keep engaging, keep testing, keep giving me space to grow stronger." "Why?" His smile was knife-sharp. "Maybe I'm curious how far you'll go. Or maybe you're hoping I'll go far enough that when you finally break me, it'll feel like a real victory, instead of just another Tuesday." She leaned closer, her silver eyes burning into his. "But here's what you haven't considered. I'm not afraid of being broken anymore, because I've already been broken, and I survived it. So the worst thing you can do to me?" She paused, letting him wonder. Already happened. Vaelor's hand shot out, gripping her chin with barely controlled violence. His aura crashed over her like a tsunami, demanding submission, demanding her wolf acknowledge his dominance. But her wolf didn't cower. It rose to meet his challenge with something that wasn't submission and wasn't dominance, but existed in territory the Empire's hierarchy had no language for. Equality. "You're insane," he breathed. "I'm free. And that makes me more dangerous than you can imagine." She pulled back from his grip, not violently, just with absolute certainty he no longer had the right to touch her. "So, do we have an agreement?" Vaelor stared at her for a long moment. The entire court watched, witnessing something unprecedented. Their king, confronted by a force that refused to yield, struggling with how to respond. Finally, he spoke. Loud enough for everyone to hear. "No agreement. You have until the next new moon to disband your so-called autonomous territory and submit to crown authority. After that, I will consider the outer districts in active rebellion and respond accordingly." Elowen nodded slowly. "Then I'll see you on the battlefield, Your Majesty." She turned and walked away. Not running, not hurrying, just leaving because she chose to, not because he dismissed her. And every person in that throne room understood they'd just witnessed the point of no return. The Empire and its alternative could no longer coexist. One would have to yield, or both would burn. The walk back from the palace should have felt like victory. Elowen had stood in that throne room, faced down the king who'd tried to erase her, and walked out on her own terms. But victory has a taste, sharp and clean, and what filled her mouth was ash. She knew what was coming. War. Real war. Not the careful maneuvering of the past months, but actual violence on a scale that would consume everything she'd built and everyone who'd chosen to stand with her. The outer districts greeted her return with celebration they couldn't afford. People lined the streets, reaching out to touch her as she passed, their faces bright with hope that made her chest tighten with something close to grief. They thought she'd won something in that throne room. They didn't understand she'd just signed their death warrant. Mara was waiting at the hollow bones, her scarred face reading Elowen's expression before a word was spoken. That bad? Worse. Elowen pushed past into the back room where her inner circle had gathered, their faces expectant. "He gave us until the new moon. After that, he brings the full force of the crown against us." "How long is that?" Thera asked. 12 days. Jarek's voice was flat. "We have 12 days to prepare for a war we can't win." The room descended into chaos. People shouting over each other, plans and counterplans colliding into noise that solved nothing. Elowen let it wash over her for a moment, feeling the weight of every choice that had led here. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with leadership, she'd learned. You can be surrounded by people, by allies and friends and true believers, and still understand with absolute clarity that the final decisions rest on shoulders that suddenly feel too narrow to bear them. She raised her hand. Silence fell gradually, reluctantly. "We knew this was possible," she said. We knew Valor wouldn't yield without forcing us to prove we could survive what came next. Her voice steadied as she spoke, finding certainty in the simple act of naming reality. So we prepare. Not to win a conventional war. We can't. But to survive long enough that the cost of crushing us becomes too high for him to maintain support. Torrin stepped forward from where he'd been standing guard at the door. I know how he fights, how he thinks. Let me... The door burst open. Two of their scouts stumbled in, bleeding from wounds that looked fresh and vicious. Their faces were white with shock and something worse, terror. They hit the supply depot. One gasped. All of it. The food stores we'd been building for winter. The medical supplies. Everything. Already? Mara's voice cracked. We have 12 days. Oh, Valor doesn't wait. The second scout pressed a hand against a gash in her side, blood seeping between her fingers. He wants us to know the clock doesn't matter, that he can strike whenever he chooses. Elowen felt cold spread through her chest. How many casualties? The scouts exchanged glances. 14 dead, twice that wounded. They came at dawn when the guards were rotating, professional, fast. Gone before we could mount a real defense. The room went silent. Not the shocked silence from before, but something heavier. The silence of people realizing abstract threat had become concrete loss. That war wasn't coming. It was already here. Who were the dead? Elowen's voice came out steady despite the scream building in her throat. The first scout pulled out a list, names scrawled in shaky handwriting, each one a person she knew, had laughed with, had promised safety to, Cass. The dock worker who'd organized the smuggling network. Dead. Sarah's father. The man whose daughter Elowen had rescued from the collection house. Dead. A dozen others. Fighters and civilians, young and old, united only in having believed that standing against the Empire was worth the risk, and now unified in being corpses. Elowen took the list with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. She read each name slowly, letting them carve themselves into memory where they'd live as evidence of what her choices cost. When she looked up, her inner circle was staring at her, waiting for her to say something that would make sense of this, that would transform loss into purpose or grief into fuel. But she had nothing, because the truth sitting in her chest like poisoned lead was simple. She'd led these people into a fight they couldn't win, had convinced them that ideals mattered more than survival, and Valor had just demonstrated what happens to ideals when they meet organized violence backed by institutional power. They get buried in mass graves. We need to reconsider, someone said. Maybe if we negotiate... There's no negotiating with what just happened, Jarrett cut in. He killed 14 people before the deadline, before we'd even broken his rules. This is a message. Then we send one back, another voice argued. Hit one of his supply lines. Show him we can strike too. With what? Mara's laugh was bitter. We just lost our entire stockpile. We're running on empty, and he knows it. Empty, and he... The arguing started again, louder this time, desperate. The sound of people watching their certainty collapse and scrambling for anything to grab onto. Elowen stood and walked out. She made it 3 blocks before the shaking started, found herself in an alley between abandoned buildings, her back against cold stone, her entire body convulsing with something that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite rage. Just the physical manifestation of understanding that she'd become exactly what she'd accused Valor of being, someone whose decisions got people killed. The only difference was he had the power to make those deaths mean something, and she had only good intentions and a rapidly shrinking number of living followers. Footsteps approached. She didn't look up, didn't particularly care who it was. Let them see her breaking. Let them understand their leader was human and fragile and drowning. It was Torrin. Of course it was. The tracker crouched beside her, not touching, just present. They trusted you, he said quietly. I know. And now they're dead. I know. She pressed her forehead against her knees. Don't make me say it. Don't make me admit that I was wrong, that this was always going to end in blood, that I should have... should have what? Torrin's voice was gentle but relentless. Let the Empire keep grinding them down? Let the debt collectors keep taking their children? Let Valor's system keep functioning exactly as designed? At least they'd be alive. Would they? Or would they just be dying slower, one piece at a time, until there was nothing left but bodies still breathing? Elowen looked up at him. His scarred face was unreadable in the dim light. You're saying their deaths mean something. I'm saying you gave them a choice. Maybe the first real choice they ever had. Fight or submit. Risk everything or accept everything. They chose. And yes, some of them died because of that choice, but at least it was theirs. That's a convenient philosophy for someone not responsible for getting them killed. Torin's jaw tightened. You think I don't carry bodies? I spent 10 years hunting people for Valor, tracking down threats and problems, and anyone who made the king uncomfortable. Most of them died. All of them died because I was good at my job. He met her eyes. The difference is they died for his fear. Your people died for their hope. I know which one I'd choose. Hope doesn't stop bleeding. No, but it's the only thing that makes bleeding mean something beyond just pain. They sat in that alley as the sun climbed higher, as the outer district stirred to life around them, as news of the attack spread and grief settled over the streets like ash. Finally, Elowen stood. Her body still ached. Her mind still screamed that she was in over her head. But beneath the fear and grief, something else stirred. Not hope. Not anymore. Something colder and more patient. Calculation. We need better intelligence, she said. Valor knew exactly where to hit us. Knew our guard rotations, our supply locations. Someone's feeding him information. Torin nodded slowly. I've been thinking the same thing. Your network grew fast. Too fast, maybe. Easy for someone to slip in who's loyal to the crown. Then we find them. And when we do, Elowen's expression could have cut stone. We make an example. Because if we're going to fight a war, we fight it with every weapon we have, including fear. The purge happened over the next 3 days. Elowen hated herself for ordering it, but necessity didn't care about self-loathing. They interrogated everyone with access to sensitive information, cross-checked stories, looked for inconsistencies, found them. 3 people. 2 had been planted by Valor's spy master from the beginning. 1 had been turned recently, his daughter held hostage in the palace district. The first 2 showed no remorse when confronted. Professionals doing a job. Torin handled them quietly, efficiently, in ways Elowen didn't ask about and didn't want to know. But the third one, Marcus, a man who'd joined them 6 weeks ago after his son was conscripted and killed in one of Valor's border wars, whose grief had seemed so real because it was real, whose betrayal came not from malice, but from the same impossible choice Elowen herself had been wrestling with, principles versus the people you love. They brought him to the back room of the Hollow Bones. His face was bruised from the initial confrontation, his hands bound, his eyes terrified and defiant in equal measure. Elowen sat across from him. The rest of the inner circle watched from the walls, their expressions ranging from fury to grief. My daughter, Marcus said, before anyone could speak. He has my daughter. Took her the day after the autonomy declaration. Said he'd return her unharmed if I fed him information. How long? Mara's voice was ice. Since the beginning. Since the first week. His laugh was broken. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to betray people fighting for exactly what I believe in? But you did it anyway, Jarek said flatly. Wouldn't you? Marcus's eyes swept the room. If it was your child, your wife, your mother, how many of you would hold on to your principles if it cost you everyone you loved? The question hung in the air. No one answered because they all knew the truth. Most of them would do exactly what Marcus had done, which made what came next even harder. You gave him the supply depot location, Elowen said quietly. Told him when the guards rotated. Marcus's face crumpled. I thought he'd just take the supplies. I didn't know that people would. 14 people died, Marcus. 14 people who trusted us to keep them safe. I know. His voice broke. I know. And I'll carry that forever. But my daughter, where is she? Palace District. He gave her some estate to guard. Safe, comfortable, as long as I keep reporting. Elowen stood, moved to the window, looked out at streets where people were trying to rebuild after the attack, trying to maintain faith that resistance meant something. Here's the thing about betrayal, she said, not turning around. It's never just about the person who committed it. It's about everyone who has to wonder if they're next. Every person in our network who now has to question whether the person next to them is reporting their conversations to the king. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't resurrect the dead. She finally turned to face him. But I understand why you did it. And that's the problem. Because if I let you live, if I show mercy, then everyone knows that having a good enough reason makes betrayal acceptable. Are you going to kill me? The room went very still. Elowen felt the weight of the question settle onto her shoulders. This was the moment, the decision that would define not just Marcus's fate, but the kind of leader she was becoming. Veilor would kill him without hesitation, would probably make it public, brutal, a warning to anyone else considering betrayal. The Silver Court she wanted to rebuild wouldn't execute someone for trying to save their child. But they weren't rebuilding the Silver Court anymore. They were fighting a war for survival. And war didn't allow for the luxury of principles that got you killed. No, she said finally, I'm not going to kill you. Marcus's relief was visible, physical, his entire body sagging. But you're not staying either. Elowen's voice was flat. Torin is going to escort you out of the city tonight. You're going to disappear, and you're going to live knowing that 14 people died because you chose your daughter over them. That's your punishment, living with it. What about my daughter? We'll get her out. Not because you deserve it, because she doesn't deserve to be a hostage. She looked at Torin. Can you arrange it? The tracker nodded slowly. I still have contacts in the palace. It'll be risky, but possible. Do it. And Marcus, she fixed the broken man with a stare that could have frozen blood. If we ever see you again, if you ever come back to Velmora, if you ever breathe a word about what we're doing here, I will personally ensure you wish I'd killed you today. Understood? He nodded, too shattered to speak. They took him away. When the room emptied except for Mara and Torin, Elowen finally let herself sit, let the exhaustion crash over her. That was merciful, Mara observed. That was strategic. Elowen rubbed her face. Killing him makes me a tyrant. Forgiving him makes me weak. Exiling him with his shame makes me someone willing to balance justice with humanity. She looked up. We need people to believe we're different from Veilor. This shows them we are. Even if it costs us? Especially if it costs us. Because the moment we start making decisions purely based on tactical advantage, we become exactly what we're fighting against. Torin cleared his throat. There's something else. The palace contacts I mentioned, they've been hearing things. Rumors that Veilor isn't just preparing for military assault. What else is there? Political maneuvering? He's calling in favors from noble houses, promising territory and titles to anyone who backs him against the autonomous districts. Building a coalition. So he's going to make this about more than just us. He's going to make it about every territory that's ever considered resisting crown authority. If he crushes you, it sends a message to everyone. And if noble houses help him do it, they become complicit in maintaining the system. Elowen felt her mind racing. Which means we need allies too, real ones. Other territories who see what's happening and choose to stand with us instead of against us. That's a big ask, Mara said. Most territories are barely surviving. They're not going to risk annihilation for ideals. Then we don't ask them to do it for ideals. We offer them the same thing we're building. Self-governance. Freedom from the crown's extraction. A chance to keep what they produce instead of sending it all to Veilor's treasury. You're talking about fracturing the empire. I'm talking about showing people the empire is already fractured. We're just making it visible. They sent delegations out the next day. Carefully chosen representatives to territories that had suffered under Veilor's policies. The mining districts where workers died in collapsed shafts because safety cost money the crown wouldn't spend. The farming territories where harvests were seized at rates that left families starving. The border regions where conscription had taken an entire generation of young men for wars nobody could explain. Not all the delegations returned. Some were turned away. Some were arrested. One was sent back with its members beaten and branded, a message from a noble house that had chosen Veilor's side decisively. But 3 territories listened. 3 sent representatives back with cautious interest. 3 asked what autonomy actually looked like in practice. It was a start. A fragile, dangerous start that Veilor would move to crush the moment he understood what was happening. The message arrived on the 8th day, delivered not by messenger but by one of Elowen's own scouts, who'd found it nailed to a tree on the outer district border. A formal declaration of war. Elowen read it in the Hollow Bones' main room, surrounded by her inner circle and the steady hum of people trying to maintain normalcy in circumstances that were anything but. The language was ceremonial, archaic, full of legal phrases about treason and rebellion, and the Crown's obligation to maintain order. But beneath the formality, the message was simple. Submit or die. 4 days remained until the new moon, 4 days to prepare for an assault that would determine whether the autonomous district survived or became a cautionary tale about what happened to people who challenged kings. Elowen set down the declaration. Around her, people waited for her to say something inspiring, something that would transform fear into courage or desperation into determination. But she'd run out of pretty words, had nothing left but truth. "We're going to lose," she said simply. "If this comes down to military force, we lose. They have trained soldiers, organized tactics, institutional support. We have passion and principles, and nowhere near enough of either to stop an army." The room went silent, shocked by the admission from someone who was supposed to inspire belief. "But losing the battle doesn't mean losing the war," she continued. "Vailor needs this to be clean, needs to crush us quickly and move on before other territories get ideas. So our strategy isn't to win, it's to survive long enough that crushing us becomes expensive." "Messy, public, how?" Thera's voice was skeptical. "We make them fight for every street, every building. We evacuate civilians but leave behind fighters who make the cost of advancing too high to justify. And we document everything." She looked at the people gathered around her. "Every death, every atrocity, every moment when the Crown's forces show exactly what kind of violence maintains their precious order. And then we make sure every territory in the Empire sees it, sees what Vailor is willing to do to people who ask for the basic right to govern themselves." She stood, her silver eyes blazing. "He wants to make us an example? Fine. We become an example, just not the one he intended." The planning consumed the next 3 days. Evacuation routes for civilians, defensive positions for fighters willing to stay, supply caches hidden throughout the district, communication networks to ensure what happened here would be witnessed and recorded. Elowen barely slept, couldn't afford to. Every hour mattered. Every decision could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. It was on the 11th day, with less than 24 hours until the new moon deadline, that Jarrett came to her with news that made her blood run cold. "We have a problem. We have several dozen problems. Be specific. The delegations we sent out, to the mining districts and farming territories. They've gone silent, all of them." Elowen looked up sharply. "Define silent. No communication, no updates. We should have heard something by now, confirmation they arrived, at minimum. But nothing. Could be natural delays. Could be." Jarrett's expression said he didn't believe that. Or could be they were intercepted, by Vailor's forces, or by the territories themselves. If word got out about what we're doing, they might have decided working with us was too risky. Elowen felt something cold settle in her stomach. Send scouts. Find out what happened. The scouts returned 6 hours later, with news that shattered everything. The mining district delegation had been arrested the moment they arrived. The noble house controlling that territory had already sworn loyalty to Vailor and saw the approach as attempted rebellion. The farming territories had turned the delegation away, refused to even hear their proposal, too afraid of Crown retaliation to risk association. And the border regions had done something worse. They'd taken the delegation, extracted every detail about the autonomous district's plans and defenses, and sent that information directly to Vailor, in exchange for reduced taxes and military protection. Elowen stared at the scout delivering this news, her mind refusing to process what she was hearing. "You're telling me we gave our enemy a complete intelligence briefing on our defensive strategy?" The scout nodded miserably. "They know everything. Troop positions, supply locations, evacuation routes, everything we told the delegation hoping to gain allies." "How long ago?" 2 days? Maybe 3, which meant Vailor had been adjusting his assault plan in real time while Elowen's network prepared defenses he already knew how to counter. The room erupted, people shouting, cursing, demanding to know who authorized the delegations, who vetted the territories, how this could have happened. But Elowen just stood there, feeling the foundation of everything she'd built crack beneath her feet. Because this wasn't just tactical failure. This was strategic annihilation. They'd lost before the battle even started. "We need to change everything," Torrin said urgently. "New positions, new routes, new—" "There's no time." Mara's voice cut through the chaos. "The assault comes at dawn. We have maybe 12 hours to completely restructure defenses he already knows we're restructuring." "So what do we do?" Thera asked. "Just surrender?" Everyone looked at Elowen, waiting for her to solve this. To pull victory from catastrophe the way leaders were supposed to. But she had nothing. No brilliant strategy, no hidden advantage. Just the crushing realization that she'd led these people into a trap that had been closing around them since the moment they'd declared autonomy. Valor had been 3 moves ahead the entire time, and she'd been too arrogant or too desperate to see it. The silence stretched, became unbearable. People started shifting, whispering, the beginning of panic taking root. Then the door to the hollow bones crashed open. A figure stumbled through, bloodied, exhausted, barely standing. It took Elowen a moment to recognize her. Celine Vex, Valor's spy master, the woman who controlled the Crown's intelligence network and had orchestrated half the moves that had brought them to this moment. She collapsed against the doorframe, her expensive clothes torn and stained, her face bruised. And when she looked up, her eyes found Elowen's with desperate intensity. "You need to run," she gasped. "All of you, tonight, he's not waiting for dawn." "What?" "Valor." He moved up the timeline. "The assault begins in 3 hours. Full military force. No warning, no mercy." Celine's laugh was bitter. "I tried to tell him it was excessive, tried to convince him to accept your surrender, but he—" She shook her head. "He's obsessed with breaking you, with proving he can crush anything that challenges him." "Why are you telling us this?" Mara demanded, her blade already drawn. "Because I'm done." Celine pushed herself upright with visible effort. Done watching him become a monster. Done facilitating the kind of brutality that makes empires collapse from the inside. Done pretending that maintaining power through fear is the same as governing. "This is a trap," Jarek said flatly. "No." Celine met his eyes. "This is betrayal. I'm betraying my king, my position, everything I've built, because he's going to kill thousands of civilians tonight and call it restoring order. And I can't—" She stopped, her voice breaking. "I won't be part of that." Elowen stared at this woman who'd been an enemy for months, trying to read truth or deception in her bruised face. "Prove it," she said quietly. "Prove you're telling the truth." Celine reached into her torn jacket and pulled out papers, documents marked with royal seals. She spread them on the nearest table. Assault plans. Complete tactical breakdown. Unit positions. Attack vectors. Everything Valor intended to use to obliterate the outer districts in a single overwhelming strike. And a notation in Valor's own handwriting. No survivors who resisted. Examples must be made. The room went silent as people processed what they were seeing. This wasn't suppression of rebellion. This was genocide dressed up as law enforcement. "He's planning to kill everyone," Thera whispered. "Not just fighters. Everyone. Anyone who stood against him. Anyone who supported autonomy. Anyone who might inspire future resistance." Celine's voice was hollow. "That's what he's become. Or maybe what he always was, and I was too loyal to see it." Elowen looked at the papers, at the evidence of systematic annihilation planned with bureaucratic efficiency. Then she looked at Celine. "Why did you really come here?" "Because you asked him a question in that throne room that I haven't been able to stop thinking about." Celine met her eyes. "You asked what kind of king needs to rely purely on force, and I realized—" She paused. "I realized I've spent 15 years helping build a throne that has no foundation beyond the ability to hurt people. And maybe that's not a throne worth defending." The choice crystallized in Elowen's mind with brutal clarity. She could trust Celine and use this information to evacuate everyone before the assault, save lives, but lose the opportunity to make the stand that might inspire other territories. Or she could assume it was a trap, maintain defensive positions, and potentially lead everyone into the exact slaughter Celine was warning against. Leadership, she'd learned, was mostly about choosing which disaster to commit to. "We evacuate," she said. "Everyone who's willing to leave. Fighters who want to stay can stay, but they do it knowing there's no victory condition, just survival and witness." Where do we go? Mara asked. Celine spoke up. I have safe houses outside the city, places Valor doesn't know about because they predate his reign. Why would you have those? Because I've been in this game longer than you've been alive, girl. And anyone with sense keeps contingency plans for when kings become tyrants. She looked around at the assembled people. I can get maybe 200 out tonight. The rest? The rest come with me, Torrin said. I know routes through the mountains, hiding places the crown hasn't used in generations. It'll be brutal, but it's survivable. The evacuation began within the hour. Organized chaos as people grabbed what they could carry and prepared to abandon everything they'd built. Some argued, some refused to leave. Most understood that staying meant dying for a cause that had just been outmaneuvered at every turn. Elowen moved through the streets, helping where she could, witnessing the collapse of what she'd tried to create. Every face she passed was a reminder of promises she couldn't keep, safety she couldn't provide. The future she'd sworn was possible but couldn't deliver. She found Mara in the hollow bones, methodically destroying documents that might identify network members who couldn't evacuate. This is my fault, Elowen said quietly. Mara looked up, her scarred face unreadable. You want me to lie and say it isn't? No. Good. Because it is your fault. You pushed too hard, too fast, declared autonomy before we had the strength to defend it, trusted delegations to territories we hadn't properly vetted. The bartender's voice wasn't cruel, just factual. You made mistakes, big ones, and people are going to die because of them. I know, but you also gave them a choice, Mara continued. Gave them hope. Showed them that the Empire isn't invincible, that resistance is possible, that someone was willing to stand up even knowing it might fail. She set down the papers she'd been burning. That matters. Even in failure, that matters. Does it? Or is that just what we tell ourselves to feel better about getting people killed? Mara smiled, sad and knowing. Maybe both. Maybe that's all any of us get. The choice to try and the knowledge that trying isn't always enough. They worked in silence for a while, destroying evidence, preparing for the end of something that had barely begun. Then Torrin appeared in the doorway. We need to go. The scouts report movement. Valor's forces are mobilizing earlier than even Celine predicted. How much time? Maybe an hour, maybe less. The final evacuations happened in desperate haste. People running through streets they'd fought to make safe, abandoning homes they'd tried to defend. Children crying, elderly struggling to keep pace. Fighters forming rear guard against an enemy that wasn't even visible yet. Elowen stood at the evacuation point, counting people as they passed, memorizing faces she might never see again. Celine coordinated routes with brutal efficiency, a woman who'd spent a career moving pieces on boards now moving people through darkness. When the last group disappeared into the night, only a dozen remained. The core of Elowen's inner circle and a handful of fighters who'd chosen to stay and bear witness. We should go, Jarek said quietly. There's nothing left to defend here. There's principle, Thera argued. There's making him work for it. There's dying for theater, Mara countered, which helps no one. Elowen looked at the empty streets, the abandoned buildings, the district that had become something more than geography and was now returning to nothing. All their work, all their hope, reduced to evacuation routes and scorched documents. And then she heard it, distant but unmistakable. The sound of organized movement, armor and weapons, hundreds of soldiers advancing with mechanical precision. Valor's army had arrived early, and they were moving fast, too fast for the rear evacuation groups to clear the kill zone. Elowen's mind raced through calculations. If the army hit the evacuation routes before people got clear, it would be slaughter. Hundreds of civilians, including children, cut down by professional soldiers, unless someone delayed them. Unless someone gave the evacuees time to escape by forcing the army to engage. She looked at Torrin, at Mara, at the dozen people who'd stayed, saw the same calculation happening in their eyes. Someone has to hold them, she said quietly. For how long? As long as it takes. She gripped her weapons, nothing fancy, just practical steel she'd learned to use in the past months. Probably not long, but long enough. I'm staying, Torrin said immediately. Me too, Mara added. One by one, the others committed, not because they thought they'd survive, but because the alternative was watching civilians die while they ran. Elowen felt something break and reform in her chest. This wasn't the victory she'd imagined, wasn't the revolution that would transform the empire. It was just a handful of people buying time with their bodies for others to escape. But maybe that's all resistance had ever been. Small acts of defiance that accumulated into change too gradual to see, but too powerful to stop. They took positions in the central square, the same place where Elowen had declared autonomy, where thousands had gathered to celebrate the possibility of something different. Now it would be their killing ground. The army appeared at the district's edge like a wall of steel and discipline. Hundreds of soldiers in perfect formation, commanders shouting orders. The machinery of empire prepared to crush a rebellion that had already mostly fled. At the front, mounted on a massive destrier, sat King Valor Kryn. He'd come personally to watch the outer districts burn. His eyes swept the empty streets, the abandoned defenses, the obvious signs of mass evacuation. His expression shifted from anticipation to fury as he understood what had happened. "They ran," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "The Great Revolution, the autonomous territories, they ran like prey when the hunt arrived." "Not all of us," Elowen called out. She stepped forward from their defensive position, letting him see her, letting him understand that she wasn't hiding anymore. Valor's gaze locked onto her. Even from this distance, she felt the weight of his attention like physical pressure. "You should have taken Celine's warning and evacuated with the others," he said. His voice was almost conversational, almost gentle. "Now you die here for nothing, not nothing, for time, for people, for the principle that someone has to stand. Principles don't stop steel. No. But they're the only thing that makes dying mean something beyond just meat stopping." Valor dismounted, walked toward her with the absolute certainty of someone who'd never lost a fight that mattered. His aura rolled out ahead of him, demanding submission, demanding her wolf acknowledge him as superior. But her wolf had forgotten how to submit. "Last chance," he said, stopping just outside striking distance. "Yield. Submit to crown authority. I'll make the punishment quick." "No." He sighed, sounded almost disappointed. "Then you die. And everyone who followed you dies knowing they backed the wrong leader. Maybe." Elowen's smile was sharp. "Or maybe they die knowing someone finally told you no and meant it." Valor's answering smile was colder. "Then, let's see how much meaning you can extract from bleeding out in the street where you declared your pathetic little rebellion." He moved. Alpha fast, king strong, every strike designed to kill. Elowen met him not as an equal, she wasn't, would never be, but as someone who'd stopped caring about equality and started caring only about making him work for it. Their first exchange was brutal. His power against her determination. His training against her desperation. The impact of their collision sent shockwaves through the square. Behind them, Valor's army surged forward, met Elowen's people in a clash of steel and fury and bodies buying seconds with their lives. The battle was never in question. 12 fighters against hundreds of trained soldiers ended one way. But for precious minutes, they held. Made the army fight for ground. Made every advance cost something. Gave the evacuation routes time to clear. Elowen fought Valor with everything she'd learned in months of survival, every dirty trick, every desperate technique, using his expectations against him, his arrogance as a weapon, his need to dominate as a weakness she could exploit. It wasn't enough. His blade caught her side, opening a wound that bled hot and immediate. His follow-up strike shattered her guard, sent her weapon skittering across cobblestones. She went down hard, her body's pain barely registering through the adrenaline and shock. Valor stood over her, his blade at her throat. Around them, the sounds of fighting were fading as her people fell one by one. They'd bought maybe 10 minutes. It would have to be enough. "You could have been Luna," Valor said softly. "Could have ruled beside me. Instead, you chose this. I chose freedom over your version of ruling. There is no freedom, only different forms of control." His blade pressed harder. "I just control honestly. Through power, everyone can see and understand. Through fear. Fear is clarity. Everything else is lies dressed up as ideals." His eyes were amber ice. "You wanted to change the empire, to show people another way. But look where it got you. Bleeding in a square while everyone you tried to save ran away. That's what ideals earn you in the real world." "Maybe." Elowen's voice was weak but steady. Or maybe I started something you can't kill just by killing me. Doubt flickered across his face, then his expression hardened into certainty. I guess we'll find out. His blade rose for the final strike. And Elowen, bleeding and beaten and staring at the end of everything she'd tried to build, felt something strange settle into her chest. Not regret, not fear, just the quiet knowledge that she'd made a choice and lived it as fully as she could, and that would have to be enough. The blade fell. But before it could connect, Celine's voice cut through the square like a whip. Stop! Veilor froze. Turned. His spymaster stood at the square's edge, surrounded by a dozen men wearing colors that weren't crown or rebellion, colors that belonged to the northern territories, the territories Veilor had thought he controlled absolutely. Stand down, Veilor ordered. No. Celine's voice was steel. I won't stand down while you commit massacre in the name of order. She gestured to the men with her. Neither will they. That's treason. That's conscience. Something you've forgotten the meaning of. She moved forward, and the northern soldiers came with her. I've served your family for 15 years, helped build your power, maintained your intelligence network, but I won't help you become the kind of tyrant that makes empires collapse from rot. Veilor's expression shifted from shock to rage. You're betraying me? You? I'm choosing which version of my loyalty matters more. Loyalty to a man or loyalty to what that man was supposed to represent. She met his eyes without flinching. You've become what we fought against. What your father died opposing, a ruler who maintains power purely through violence, and yet you maintained that power for me gladly enough. Because I thought you'd grow into something better, that given time and support, you'd learn to rule with something other than fear. Celine's voice cracked. But you haven't. You've gotten worse, more brutal, more willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to maintain control. The square had gone silent. Soldiers watching their king confronted by the woman who'd helped put him there. Elowen, bleeding on the cobblestones, watching the empire fracture in real time. If you leave now, Veilor said quietly, I'll consider it temporary insanity. You can come back. Resume your position. This doesn't have to mean war between us. Celine smiled sadly. Yes, it does. Because I'm not just leaving. I'm taking the northern territories with me. They've agreed to autonomous governance under principles similar to what Elowen was building. The words hung in the air like a blade over the throne. Veilor's face went white, then red, then a shade of fury that had no color. You're fracturing my empire. Your empire fractured itself the moment you chose brutality over justice. I'm just making it visible. Veilor looked at Elowen then, really looked at her. And in his eyes she saw something that might have been recognition or might have been the grudging respect of someone realizing they'd underestimated their opponent. This isn't over, he said. No. Elowen agreed, her voice barely a whisper. It's just beginning. Veilor sheathed his blade, signaled his forces to withdraw. But before he left, he crouched beside Elowen, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You've won today, but you've also shown me something. What? That you're dangerous. Not because you're strong, but because you make people believe change is possible. And belief is the only thing that can actually threaten thrones. His smile was sharp. So congratulations, you've graduated from problem to existential threat. Good, she managed. I was getting bored with problem. He stood, looked at her one more time with something in his expression she couldn't read, and walked away. His army followed, leaving Elowen bleeding in the square with Celine's forces surrounding her and the outer districts saved by betrayal from the last person anyone expected. The rebellion hadn't won, but it hadn't lost either. It had become something else entirely, something that would force Veilor to choose between the king he claimed to be and the tyrant he was becoming. And in that choice, everything would be decided. Elowen closed her eyes, feeling hands lift her, hearing voices discussing medical treatment and evacuation and next steps. But beneath the pain and exhaustion, she smiled, because she'd just learned the most important lesson resistance ever taught. You don't beat empires by defeating them in battle. You beat them by giving people an alternative worth fighting for. And that fight had only just begun. Pain has a way of clarifying things, strips away pretense and philosophy until all that's left is the animal truth of survival. Elowen learned this as Celine's medics worked on the gash in her side, their hands efficient but not gentle, their voices discussing blood loss and infection risk like she was a tactical problem rather than a person bleeding onto a makeshift operating table. She didn't mind. Tactical problems could be solved. People were messier. The Northern Territories had provided a safe house. Calling it that was generous. It was really just an abandoned mill 20 miles outside Velmora. But it was defensible and far enough from Valor's immediate reach that they could breathe without expecting steel through the ribs. Celine stood by the window, watching the road with the paranoia of someone who'd spent a career making sure threats didn't reach their targets. Now she was the threat, the defector, the spy master who'd turned on her king and fractured his empire in the process. "You're wondering if I'll regret this," she said without turning around. Elowen gritted her teeth as a medic stitched the wound. "Are you? Ask me when we're not being hunted." Celine finally looked at her, and in the spy master's eyes was something Elowen recognized because she'd seen it in her own reflection lately. The exhaustion that comes from carrying choices too heavy to put down. "I spent 15 years building Valor's intelligence network, making him untouchable. And in one night, I destroyed it all. Why? Because there's a difference between serving power and serving monstrosity. I thought I knew where that line was." Her laugh was bitter. "Turns out I drew it 3 years too late. Better late than never. Tell that to the people who died while I was still serving the monster." The door burst open. Torin entered with Mara and Jarek, all three looking like they'd been running. Their faces carried news that wasn't good. "Evacuations are complete," Torin reported. "Most people made it to safe zones in the farming territories and mountain passes." But what?" Elowen tried to sit up, immediately regretted it as pain lanced through her side. "Valor's calling a council." Mara's voice was tight. "All noble houses, all territory leaders. He's framing the Northern Territories' defection as an act of war and demanding unified response." "When?" 3 days. At the palace. Full formal assembly." Jarek moved closer, his expression grave. "He's going to force every territory to choose, back him and maintain the empire, or side with autonomy and face annihilation." Smart. Elowen's mind raced despite the pain and exhaustion. He's making it binary, making fence-sitting impossible. "Which means we need to be there," Celine said. "Need to present our case before he controls the narrative completely." "You can't go back to the palace," one of the medics protested. "Your wounds will kill me slower than Valor will if we lose the political war." Elowen pushed herself upright, her vision swimming. "He's forcing a decision point. If we're not there to argue our side, every territory hears only his version. And if you are there, you die," Mara said flatly. "The moment you walk into that palace, he'll arrest you, execute you for treason. Problem solved. Not if I invoke old law." Elowen looked at Celine. "The Code of Challenges. It's still technically valid, right?" The spy master's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." "What's the Code of Challenges?" Jarek asked. "Ancient law from before Valor's grandfather consolidated power," Celine explained. "If a citizen believes they've been wronged by the crown, they can challenge the ruler directly. Single combat. Winner takes the grievance." "So she fights Valor one-on-one?" Torin's voice was skeptical. "She can barely stand. He's Alpha Prime and trained since childhood. That's not a fight. That's execution with extra steps." "Maybe." Elowen met his eyes. "Or maybe it's the only way to force him into a position where he has to acknowledge I'm not just a problem to eliminate, that I represent something he can't dismiss." "You represent a challenge to his throne," Mara said, "which means he'll kill you the moment combat starts. Then I better make the dying count for something." The room went silent. They all understood what she was saying. This wasn't about winning a fight. It was about creating a moment so public, so undeniable, that whatever happened would force the Empire to confront what it had become. Either Valor would kill her and prove he was a tyrant who murdered citizens for demanding justice, or she'd survive long enough to make him show his true face to every noble house watching. Both options ended with her blood on marble, but only one changed what that blood meant. "I'll do it," she said. "Invoke the challenge. Force him to face me in front of the council." "He'll refuse," Jarek argued. "He's king. He doesn't have to accept challenges from traitors." "He does, if I invoke it correctly." Elowen looked at Celine. The code requires the challenger to present themselves unarmed before the full council, to state their grievance publicly. The king can refuse, but it makes him look weak, afraid. And Valor's many things, Celine said slowly, but afraid isn't one he'll tolerate people thinking. So he accepts, fights you, kills you. How does that help? Mara's frustration was palpable, because while he's killing me, every territory leader in that room will be watching, seeing what the Empire does to people who ask for basic rights, seeing the violence that maintains their precious order. Elowen's voice strengthened despite her body's weakness. I'm not trying to beat him in combat. I'm trying to beat him in the story that gets told afterward. That's a lot of faith in people caring about stories when power is on the line. Power is stories. It is the only thing it ever was. She looked around at her inner circle, at the people who'd followed her this far despite everything. Valor rules because people believe he should. That belief is built on narratives about strength and order and necessity. I'm going to crack that narrative. Show them it's built on corpses and lies. And if cracking it costs your life, then someone else picks up the pieces and keeps building. She tried to smile, manage something close. That's how movements work. They don't depend on one person surviving. They depend on ideas surviving. The preparation for the council consumed the next 2 days. Elowen could barely walk without assistance, but Celine's medics worked miracles with poultices and binding and chemical compounds that numbed pain without completely dulling awareness. Torin drilled her on combat despite her injuries, not teaching her to win, they both knew that was impossible, but teaching her to last, to make Valor work for it, to survive long enough that the fight itself became a statement. Your only advantage is he'll underestimate you, the tracker said as she blocked his strikes with agonizing slowness. He sees you as Omega, as inherently weaker. Use that. Make him think he's won before he has. Then surprise him. Surprise him how? I'm half his strength and working with one functional side. So don't fight his fight. Change the rules. Make it about endurance instead of power, about will instead of strength. He gestured to her brand, the mark of rejection visible above her training clothes. You've survived what should have killed you 3 times now. That's your weapon. The fact that you're still here when you shouldn't be. Meanwhile, Celine worked the political angles, sending messages to territory leaders she knew were wavering, presenting evidence of Valor's excesses, building a coalition not of rebels, but of people tired of paying the Empire's costs without seeing its benefits. The northern territories are with us, she reported on the second night. Formally declared autonomous governance. 3 farming territories are considering it. The mining districts are split. Half the noble houses want to join us. Half are terrified of Valor's retaliation. What about the border regions? The ones who betrayed us? Celine's expression darkened. They're doubling down on loyalty to the crown, offering increased taxes and military support in exchange for protection and favor. So we're fracturing the Empire exactly as Valor feared, not exactly as he feared. Worse, because this isn't violent rebellion he can crush with soldiers. It's political dissolution he has to negotiate with. And negotiation isn't his strength. What is his strength? Domination. Control. Making people believe resistance is impossible. Celine met Elowen's eyes. Which is why your challenge matters. You're not just fighting him physically, you're fighting the narrative that he's unbeatable. On the morning of the council, Elowen dressed in simple clothes. No armor, no ceremonial garb, just practical fabric that wouldn't restrict movement and could absorb blood without showing it too obviously. She left the brand visible. Let them see what their king had done to her. Mara helped her with the bindings around her wounded side, her scarred hands gentle despite their roughness. You know this is insane, right? I've been told. And you're doing it anyway. Someone has to. Elowen tested her range of motion, wincing at the limitation. Besides, insanity seems to be working for me so far. Until it doesn't. Mara's voice was quiet. Until you're bleeding out on a throne room floor, and I'm explaining to everyone who believed in you why I let you do this. You didn't let me do anything. I chose it. Same as they did. She gripped her friend's shoulder. And if it goes wrong, you keep building. You take what we started and make it work. Promise me. Mara's jaw tightened. I promise. But I'm also promising to kick your ghost if you die stupidly. Deal. The journey to the palace was tense and silent. Celine had arranged for safe passage through a network of contacts who'd chosen autonomy over empire. But every mile closer to Velmora felt like approaching the maw of something massive and hungry. The city looked different than Elowen remembered. More guards on the streets, more checkpoints. The visible manifestation of an empire tightening its grip in response to territories slipping through its fingers. People watched their carriage pass with expressions ranging from hope to fear to the careful neutrality of those who'd learned that taking sides got you killed. The palace rose ahead like a monument to permanence, all marble and gold and the architectural embodiment of power that believed itself eternal. Elowen felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Pain radiated from her side with each beat. Her hands wanted to shake, but she forced them still. This was it. The moment everything had been building toward since the night Valor had rejected her and thought that would be the end of her story. Instead, it had just been the beginning. The council chamber was enormous, designed to make anyone entering feel small and insignificant. Tiered seating rose toward a vaulted ceiling, every noble house and territory represented by leaders wearing colors and insignia that marked generations of accumulated power. At the chamber's center, elevated above everyone else, sat the throne, and on it, King Valor Kryn. He looked exactly as Elowen remembered, dark and massive and radiating the kind of controlled dominance that made lesser wolves want to submit before he even spoke. But there was something new in his expression when he saw her enter. Recognition. And beneath it, something that might have been anticipation. He'd been expecting this. The chamber went silent as Elowen walked down the central aisle. Every eye tracked her movement, her visible brand, the careful way she moved that betrayed recent injury. She stopped in the designated position for petitioners, unarmed and alone in the center of hostile power. Elowen Draith, Valor's voice carried through the chamber with absolute authority. You stand accused of treason, sedition, and attempting to fracture the empire. How do you answer these charges? I invoke the Code of Challenges. Her voice was steady despite her thundering heart. I claim the king has wronged me through unjust rejection and subsequent persecution. I demand the right to challenge him directly for redress of grievances. Murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles. The Code of Challenges hadn't been invoked in 3 generations. Most had thought it was purely ceremonial, a relic with no practical application. Valor's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his amber eyes. You're challenging your king to single combat? I'm challenging a man who called me unworthy while building an empire on the bodies of people he considers expendable. She let her gaze sweep across the assembled territories. I'm demanding he prove his right to rule with something other than inherited position and institutional violence. The murmurs grew louder. Several territory leaders leaned forward, suddenly interested. This wasn't just legal theater anymore. This was someone directly questioning the foundations of imperial power. Valor stood slowly. The movement was deliberately casual, but Elowen felt the shift in the room's energy. Predator recognizing a challenge. You can barely stand, he observed. Your wounds from our last encounter haven't healed. This isn't a challenge. It's suicide. Then accepting should be easy for you. Quick execution. Problem solved. She took a step forward, ignoring the pain that lanced through her side. Unless you're afraid that killing an injured woman in front of all these witnesses will make you look less like a king and more like a butcher. The insult landed deliberately. Several nobles gasped. You didn't speak to the king that way. Didn't challenge his courage or imply weakness. But Elowen wasn't playing by the rules anymore. And the only way to break a system was to refuse its fundamental premises. Valor descended from his throne with predatory grace, crossed the distance between them until he stood close enough that she could see the flecks of darker gold in his eyes. You want to die in front of an audience? He asked quietly. Want to make yourself a martyr? I want them to see what empire really costs, she replied just as quietly. Want every person in this room to watch you kill someone for demanding basic justice. To see the violence that maintains your throne stripped of all ceremony and excuse. And you think that'll change anything? I think it'll make maintaining the lie harder. She held his gaze. You can kill me, but you can't kill what I represent. And every territory watching will have to decide if they want to keep supporting a system that requires this kind of brutality. Valor studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled, sharp and cold. Challenge accepted. He turned to address the council. Under the Code of Challenges, combat will commence immediately. No armor, No weapons beyond what we carry naturally. First blood ends it. First blood? Elowen hadn't expected that. The traditional code called for combat until one party yielded or died. I'm not a monster, Valor said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Despite what she claims, this is justice, not execution. She drew first blood from the Empire. I'll draw first blood from her. That satisfies the code. Several nobles nodded approvingly, the king showing mercy. Civilization maintained even in combat. But Elowen understood what he was really doing, making this quick, controlled, minimizing the spectacle that might inspire sympathy or outrage. She had to change that. No, she said clearly. Traditional terms. Combat until yield or death. The chamber went silent. Valor's eyes narrowed. You're demanding deathmatch? I'm demanding you fight me like I'm actually worth fighting, not some pest you swat away to maintain appearances. She raised her voice to address the full council. If the king believes he's right, if he believes his empire is just and necessary, then let him prove it. Not with first blood, with the full measure of what his rule demands. It was a gamble, a massive one. But it forced Valor into a position where showing mercy looked like weakness, and weakness was the one thing an Alpha King couldn't afford to display. His jaw tightened. Fine. Deathmatch. Your funeral. They cleared the center of the chamber. Territory leaders moved to the upper tiers, getting the best view of the spectacle that was about to unfold. Servants brought water and clean cloths for afterward. Medical staff stood ready, everyone preparing for an execution dressed up as formal combat. Elowen removed her outer layer, standing in just binding and basic clothes. The brand on her collarbone was starkly visible. The wound in her side was covered, but the binding showed dark stains. Valor stripped to the waist, revealing a body that was pure functional muscle. Scars crossed his torso and arms, evidence of a lifetime of combat and the violence required to hold a throne. They faced each other across 10 feet of marble that would soon be painted red. An arbiter stepped forward, an elderly noble whose house predated even Valor's bloodline. His voice carried the weight of tradition. Combat begins at my signal, continues until one party yields or can no longer fight. May the righteous prevail. He dropped his hand. Valor moved like lightning, closed the distance before Elowen could fully react, his strike aimed at her wounded side with surgical precision. She barely twisted away, his knuckles grazing her ribs instead of driving into injury. The pain still made her vision white out for a second. Can't even dodge properly, he said. This won't take long. Good. I have dinner plans. His next combination was faster, more aggressive. Testing her defenses, finding weaknesses, establishing the overwhelming gap between their capabilities. Elowen gave ground, not running, just acknowledging reality. She couldn't match his speed or strength, couldn't win through conventional combat, so she'd have to win through everything else. She let him drive her back against the chamber wall, let him think he had her trapped, then used the wall for leverage, pushing off in an angle he wasn't expecting, her elbow catching his temple. The strike wasn't powerful enough to damage, but it surprised him, and surprise was all she had. The fight became a brutal lesson in the difference between trained strength and desperate survival. Valor's strikes were precise, economical, designed to disable and destroy. Elowen's were wild, improvised, the combat style of someone who'd learned to fight in alleys rather than training yards. He caught her with a kidney shot that sent her to her knees. She rolled, came up swinging, her fist connecting with his ribs in a hit that would have dropped a normal fighter. He barely grunted. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. Good, she gasped. Wouldn't want you getting bored. The watching nobles were silent now, riveted. This wasn't the quick execution they'd expected. It was something rawer, more real. Two people fighting not just with bodies, but with everything they represented. Empire versus autonomy. Control versus freedom. The old way versus something new trying to be born. Elowen knew she was losing, could feel her body breaking down, the wound in her side reopening, blood soaking through the binding. Her vision was starting to blur, her strikes getting slower, but she was still standing, still making him work for it, still refusing to yield. And in the watching faces of territory leaders, she saw something shifting. Not necessarily support, but acknowledgement. That maybe the Empire's version of order required more violence than they'd been comfortable admitting. That maybe the person bleeding on the marble had a point. Valor caught her with a combination that should have ended it, should have broken ribs and consciousness in equal measure. But Elowen had learned something in the months since her rejection, had discovered that the human body can absorb insane amounts of damage when the mind refuses to acknowledge defeat. She stayed on her feet, barely, swaying like a tree in a storm, but standing. Valor's expression shifted from certainty to something closer to frustration. Or possibly respect. "Why won't you just fall?" he demanded. "Because falling means accepting your version of the world. And I'd rather die than do that, than die." His next strike was meant to kill. Full force, aimed at her head, everything he had behind it. Elowen didn't dodge, didn't try to block. She stepped into it, inside his guard, where power mattered less than position. Her forehead caught his chin. Her knee drove into his stomach. Neither blow was devastating, but both were enough to break his momentum, to make him stumble backward, to make the watching nobles gasp as their invincible king looked momentarily human. Valor recovered instantly, but something had changed in his eyes. Not fear exactly, but recognition that this wasn't the one-sided beating he'd expected, that the woman he'd rejected and discarded and tried to erase had become something he couldn't simply dismiss. They circled each other now, both bleeding, both breathing hard. The gap in their abilities still massive, but the gap in their determination, that was narrower. "You've made your point," Valor said. "You've shown you can endure, can survive. Now yield before I have to kill you for real." "No." "Why not?" "Because yielding means accepting that survival is enough." She wiped blood from her mouth. "And I didn't come here to survive. I came here to change things. You can't change anything dead." "Maybe. Or maybe my death changes more than my survival would." She looked past him to the assembled nobles. Maybe they need to see what their empire actually does to people who demand justice, what it costs to maintain the order they benefit from. Valor's jaw tightened. "You're not a martyr. You're a traitor, and when I kill you, that's how you'll be remembered." "Then kill me." "Stop talking and do it." She spread her arms, leaving herself completely open. "Show everyone watching what happens to citizens who challenge kings. Make them watch you execute an injured woman for demanding the rights you claim your empire guarantees." It was the ultimate gamble, forcing him to choose between being a king who murdered citizens or a king who looked weak by hesitating. The chamber held its breath. Valor moved, not to strike, but to close distance. His hand shot out, gripping her throat, lifting her off the ground with terrifying ease. Elowen didn't struggle, just met his eyes as air stopped reaching her lungs, watching him watch her die. And in that moment, suspended between life and death, she saw something crack in his expression, some barrier he'd maintained between what he told himself he was and what he actually did. He saw himself reflected in her silver eyes, saw what he was choosing, what he was becoming. The mask slipped, just for a second, but a second was enough. He dropped her. Elowen collapsed, gasping for air, her throat screaming, her body finally giving up on the pretense of functional, but alive. Valor stood over her, his expression unreadable. The chamber was absolutely silent. Then he turned to address the council. His voice was carefully controlled, too controlled. "The challenge is satisfied. I've demonstrated superior strength. The grievance is resolved in favor of the crown." "But you didn't kill her," someone called out. "A territory leader from the eastern reaches. The code requires combat until yield or death. She hasn't yielded. She's no longer a threat. That's sufficient." "Is it?" Another voice. A noblewoman from the farming territories. Because it looks like the king hesitated. Like maybe he couldn't follow through. Murmurs spread through the chamber, not rebellion, just recognition that something unprecedented had happened. Their invincible king had blinked, had shown mercy or weakness depending on interpretation, and interpretation was everything in political theater. Valor's aura flared. "Enough! This assembly is—" "I'm not done!" Elowen rasped. She forced herself to her knees, then to her feet, blood running down her side, her throat bruised, her body screaming that staying conscious was optional at this point. But standing anyway. "The code says until yield or death," she continued. "I haven't yielded. And I'm not dead. So the challenge continues." Valor turned to face her. His expression was beyond fury. It was something colder, more final. You want to die that badly? I want them to see what this system really is. She gestured weakly to the assembled nobles. You've built an empire on the idea that strength makes right, that power justifies itself. But when challenged, when forced to actually prove that right, you hesitated. I showed mercy. You showed doubt. And doubt in a system built on absolute certainty is corrosive. She took a shaky step forward. So either kill me and prove you're the tyrant I claimed, or acknowledge that maybe your empire doesn't have all the answers, that maybe people demanding autonomy deserve something other than violence. The choice hung in the air like a blade. Valor could finish this, could kill her now and restore his appearance of absolute power. But doing so would confirm everything she'd accused him of, or he could continue to show restraint, continue to demonstrate that even he recognized some limit to the violence empire required, but that made him look weak, uncertain, human. Neither option gave him what he needed, which meant Elowen had already won something, even if she died here. She'd shown that the Emperor's power wasn't absolute, that even he had to make choices that cost him something. Make your decision, she said quietly. Be the king you claim to be, or show them what you really are. Valor's hands clenched into fists. His aura crashed over the room like a tidal wave, making several nobles stumble. Then he spoke. Loud enough for everyone to hear. Guards, arrest her. Elowen felt her heart sink. Not death. Worse. Indefinite imprisonment where she'd disappear without the spectacle that might inspire outrage. But before the guards could move, Celine's voice cut through the chamber. On what charge? Valor turned to face his former spymaster. Treason. Sedition. Take your pick. She invoked the code of challenges. You accepted. The combat isn't finished according to the code's terms. Arresting her now violates ancient law. Celine moved forward, and Elowen saw she wasn't alone. The Northern Territory leaders flanked her, along with representatives from 3 farming territories, a growing coalition. You can't claim to uphold law and tradition while selectively ignoring it when convenient. I'm the law, Valor snarled. No! Celine's voice was ice. You're a man on a throne. The law is what we collectively agree it is. And right now, in front of all these witnesses, you're showing us that your version of law is just power with paperwork. More murmurs, louder now. Territory leaders whispering to each other, reassessing, reconsidering their allegiances. The empire was fracturing in real time, and Valor knew it. His expression went through several transformations. Rage, calculation, something that might have been grief for the certainty he was losing. Then he made his choice. Fine. The challenge continues. But not here. Not now. He gestured to Elowen's obviously failing body. She can barely stand. I won't be accused of killing an opponent who can't defend herself. That's mercy, the Arbiter observed carefully. That's strategy, Valor corrected. We reconvene in 3 days. She gets medical treatment, recovers enough to make this a real fight. Then we finish it, properly. And in the meantime? In the meantime, she remains under house arrest in the palace, supervised, safe, but not free to continue building her rebellion. Elowen wanted to protest, wanted to demand they finish it now, while she still had the strength to make her death mean something. But Torrhen's voice echoed in her mind from training. Make him think he's won before he has. Then surprise him. 3 days gave her people time to mobilize, time for the political fractures she'd created to widen. Time for territory leaders to watch the empire's response and decide which side they wanted to be on when everything collapsed. I accept, she said. 3 days. Valor nodded curtly. Then guards, escort her to the east wing. Medical staff, attend to her wounds. And someone get this blood off my floor. They moved to take her arms. Elowen let them, her body finally giving up on the pretense of independence. As they led her away, she caught Celine's eyes. The spymaster gave the barest nod. The game had changed, but it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The east wing of the palace was designed for guests who were simultaneously valued and mistrusted. Comfortable apartments with heavy guards at every exit, luxury that felt like a cage. Elowen collapsed onto the bed as soon as the doors closed, her body finally allowed to acknowledge how close to death she'd come. Medics swarmed immediately. Palace physicians who worked with efficiency that came from treating combat wounds regularly. They rebound her side, administered compounds that dulled pain, checked for internal bleeding. "You're lucky to be alive," one observed. "Luck had nothing to do with it," she managed. They left her with guards posted outside and instructions to rest that she had no intention of following. The moment they were gone, she forced herself to sit up, to assess her situation. 3 days. 3 days to heal enough that the final fight wouldn't be immediate execution. 3 days for her network to act on whatever plan they were formulating without her. 3 days for Valor to reconsider showing mercy and decide to finish this quietly. A quiet knock on the door. Before she could respond, it opened. Valor entered alone. No guards. No ceremony. Just a man who ruled an empire coming to see the woman trying to dismantle it. Elowen's hand moved instinctively toward a weapon she didn't have. "Relax," he said. "I'm not here to kill you. If I wanted that, you'd never have left the council chamber." "Then why are you here?" He moved to the window, looking out over the city he controlled. "Good question. I've been asking myself that since I let you stand back up." "You could have ended it," she said. "Could have killed me and solved your problem. That's what I told myself I'd do." His voice was quiet. "End the challenge. Restore order. Demonstrate that rebellion costs everything." He turned to face her. "But when I had my hand on your throat, when I was watching you die, I realized something." "What?" "That I wanted you to survive, and I have no idea why." The admission hung in the air between them, dangerous and honest in equal measure. "Maybe because killing me doesn't solve your actual problem," Elowen said carefully. "It just creates a martyr and accelerates the fracturing you're trying to prevent." "Maybe. Or maybe it's simpler than that." He moved closer, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I've been obsessed with you since the moment you stood in my throne room and didn't break when you were supposed to." Obsession isn't the same as respect. No, but it's close to it. He stopped just outside striking distance. "You asked me in the council chamber what I really am. King or tyrant, ruler or monster, and I don't have an answer, because the answer is both. The system you inherited requires it." "Does it?" His amber eyes were intense. "Or have I just convinced myself it does because it's easier than admitting there might be another way?" Elowen felt her breath catch. This was the conversation they should have had months ago, before the rejection, before the war, before everything collapsed into violence. "The other way costs power," she said. "Requires admitting you don't have all the answers, that people might govern themselves better than you govern them. And if I admitted that, what happens to the empire? It changes. Or it falls. Probably both." She held his gaze. "But maybe what comes after is better than what you're desperately trying to maintain. Or maybe it's chaos and suffering on a scale that makes my brutality look like mercy. Maybe." She leaned forward despite the pain. "Or maybe you're afraid of what happens if it works. If people prove they don't need kings, don't need the system that made you important." The words struck something. She saw it in his expression, not anger, something more vulnerable. Fear that he'd built his entire identity on a lie, that power was just a story that could be rewritten. "I should kill you," he said quietly. "For my throne, for my empire, for everything I've spent my life building and maintaining. But you won't." "No." His smile was sharp and sad. "I won't, because some part of me wants to see if you're right, if there's actually an alternative to what I've become. That's not mercy, that's curiosity. Call it what you want. The outcome's the same." He moved toward the door. 3 days. Heal. Recover. And then we finish this properly. Properly meaning? Meaning I actually try to kill you instead of hesitating. Because whatever this is between us, it can't coexist with both of us ruling. One of us yields or dies. That's how this ends. Or we could choose a third option. There is no third option. That's the problem with stories like ours. They only end one way. He left before she could respond. Elowen sat in the too comfortable bed, her body aching, her mind racing, her heart doing something she couldn't name and didn't have time for. Because Valor was right about one thing, this only ended one way, with one of them standing and one of them broken. The question was which one would be which, and whether the Empire would survive finding out. Outside her window, Velmora sprawled in the fading light, beautiful and brutal, a monument to power built on foundations that were crumbling faster than anyone wanted to acknowledge. 3 days until the final confrontation. 3 days to decide if she was fighting for revolution or something more complicated. 3 days until everything shattered or transformed. And Elowen Draith, rejected mate turned revolutionary, sat at the center of it all and wondered if she'd survive to see which one it would be. The thing about endings is they never arrive the way you expect. You spend your whole life building towards some imagined climax, some moment of absolute clarity where everything makes sense. Then the moment comes, and all you feel is the weight of every choice that led there, pressing down like gravity multiplied. Elowen spent the first of her 3 days in a fever dream, her body finally acknowledging the damage she'd forced it to ignore, infections blooming from wounds that should have been tended immediately, her consciousness drifting between waking nightmares and memories she couldn't distinguish from hallucination. The palace physicians worked with grim efficiency. They'd seen this before, bodies pushed beyond their limits by ideology or desperation. Most didn't survive. The ones who did carried scars that went deeper than skin. By the second day, the fever broke. Elowen woke to find Celine sitting beside her bed, the spy master's expression unreadable in the pre-dawn light. "You almost died," Celine said without preamble. "Another 6 hours and the infection would have spread too far to stop." But it didn't. "No. Which means you get to face Valor after all. Lucky you." Elowen tried to sit up, managed it on the third attempt. Her body felt like it belonged to someone else. Lighter. Hollower. Like the fever had burned away everything except the essential framework. What's happening out there? In the territories? Chaos. Beautiful, terrifying chaos. Celine stood, moved to the window. 5 more territories have declared autonomy since your challenge. The noble houses are fracturing, some backing Valor absolutely, others hedging their bets, a few openly supporting your movement. Movement. Is that what we're calling it? Revolution sounds too violent. Reform sounds too mild. Movement captures the ambiguity, the sense that something's shifting, but no one knows what it'll become yet. And Valor? Celine's expression darkened. Preparing. He's called in every favor, made promises that'll bankrupt the treasury if he keeps them. Positioned this final combat as the moment that determines the Empire's future. No pressure then. You wanted to change things. Celine turned to face her. This is what change looks like. Messy and desperate and hanging on the outcome of a fight you probably can't win. Probably? Definitely. Let's not pretend otherwise. You're still injured, still weaker, still fundamentally outmatched in every metric that matters in combat. So why are you here? Why help me at all if you think I'm going to lose? Because winning and mattering are different things. You can lose the fight and still win the war. Your challenge already accomplished something Valor didn't anticipate. It made people question whether the system they've accepted requires the violence it demands. And questions like that don't stop just because the person who asked them dies. That's a convenient philosophy for someone not doing the dying. Celine smiled, sharp and sad. I've spent 15 years watching people die for power. Watched Valor sacrifice anyone who challenged him. Watched the Empire grind people down and call it necessity. She moved closer, her voice dropping. You're the first person I've seen who might die for something that makes that death mean something other than just another body maintaining the status quo. You're betting a lot on might. I'm betting everything, same as you. The spy master pulled a small vial from her pocket. This will help with the pain. Not eliminate it, but make it manageable. You'll need every advantage when the time comes. Elowen took the vial, studied it. What's the cost? Of the medicine? Nothing. Of your help. Of all this. You betrayed your king for me. What do you want in return? To see if there's actually another way. To know whether the empire I helped build was necessary or if I've just been justifying brutality for 15 years. Celine met her eyes. If you win, if you somehow survive and transform this system, then maybe all the compromises I made weren't for nothing. And if you lose, she paused. At least I'll know I tried to be part of something better before the end. The honesty was brutal and beautiful. 2 women who'd spent their lives in different versions of service to power, now gambling everything on the possibility that power itself could be redefined. Thank you, Elowen said quietly. Don't thank me yet. Save it for if you survive. On the 3rd day, Elowen woke before dawn and began preparing with the methodical focus of someone who understood this might be their last morning. The palace had provided clothes that were practical but elegant. She chose the simplest option, nothing that would restrict movement or provide psychological armor. She was going into this fight as herself, nothing more, nothing less. The brand on her collarbone caught her reflection's eye. She traced it with her fingers, feeling the raised scar tissue that had once symbolized rejection and now meant something else entirely. Transformation. Survival. The visible proof that what was meant to destroy her had instead forged her into something the Empire had no category for. A knock on the door. Torrin entered, his scarred face grave. "It's time." She nodded, stood, tested her body's response and found it functional, if not optimal. The physicians had worked miracles. She could move, could fight, could last longer than anyone had right to expect given where she'd been 3 days ago. But lasting wasn't winning, and they both knew it. "Your people are positioned," Torrin said as they walked through palace corridors. "Mara's coordinating from the northern territories. Jarek has the farming districts ready to move depending on the outcome. Thera's organized the outer districts into defensive positions in case Veilor tries to use your death as an excuse for wholesale slaughter. And if I win?" The tracker's smile was thin. "Then we figure out what governing actually looks like when you're not just resisting, but building. The harder part, probably." They reached the council chamber. Guards stood at attention, their expressions carefully neutral. These were professional soldiers who'd learned that kings rose and fell, but their job remained constant: protect whoever held power. Elowen wondered how many of them would be protecting someone